April 23, 1856. Granville Taylor Woods entered the world in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest house within hearing distance of the main line, where trains passed often enough that family conversation had to pause whenever a whistle sounded from the yards. His parents, Martha J. Brown and Cyrus Woods, were determined to hold a stable home in a state that officially rejected enslavement, yet still forced black families into the lowest paid and most dangerous work. The baby shared a neighborhood with laborers, laundresses, and carmen whose schedules followed railroad timetables rather than church bells or school hours, and the pattern of his earliest days depended on the irregular passage of freight and passenger trains across the city. By the time Granville could stand at the doorway on his own, the street outside showed iron rails and wagon ruts in the same strip of dirt. Telegraph poles stood at regular intervals along the right-of-way. Bare wooden posts with crossarms and dark glass insulators that caught the light when the sun angled a certain way. Coal smoke drifted from locomotives into nearby yards and kitchens, settling into curtains and clothing so that the smell of fuel and hot metal became part of daily life. Car wheels hitting rail joints produced a steady pattern of impact that everyone in the district recognized without needing to look toward the track. The legal status of the family did not protect them from humiliation or poverty. Ohio law barred enslavement, but it did not guarantee equality, and many white employers treated black workers as expendable. Martha stretched food and clothing to cover Granville, his brother Lyotts and his sister Rachel, patching garments until cloth thinned through repeated washing. Cyrus took whatever work he could find, hauling, loading, or assisting skilled men for wages that scarcely covered rent and coal. In quiet moments, the parents spoke in low tones about bills and debts, careful not to alarm the children, yet the tension in their posture and the way they counted coins at the table showed clearly how little they had left each week. When Granville reached school age, he joined other neighborhood children in a simple classroom that offered basic literacy and arithmetic. The building lacked proper heating, and in winter the teacher sometimes dismissed pupils early because fingers grew too stiff to hold pencils. White children in other parts of Columbus had access to better-equipped schools and longer terms, but Granville and his classmates accepted their conditions because there appeared to be no alternative. He learned quickly, especially with numbers and simple mechanical drawings, and he filled scrap paper with sketches of wheels, linkages, and crude locomotives whenever lessons ended early. That promising start did not last for long. Around the age of 10, Granville left school because the family needed income more urgently than they needed a boy with books. The decision was not framed as a choice in a generous sense. Cyrus explained that food, coal, and rent had to come first, and that every pair of hands in the household had to contribute. Granville did not argue. He understood that failure to meet payments could push the family onto the street or into worse districts where violence and disease claimed neighbors without warning. Within weeks, he shifted from a desk in a cold classroom to unpaid errands that would lead into steady work. His first tasks in the working world were simple but exhausting. He carried water and tools for older men in small machine shops that clustered near the railroad lines, swept up metal shavings that cut skin if handled carelessly, and hauled coal and scrap to storage bins. The atmosphere in those shops bore little resemblance to the schoolhouse. Noise from hammers, belt-driven lathes, and planers filled the air, and the constant vibration from nearby trains rattled windows and made surfaces tremble. A layer of oily dust coated benches and walls, and the only quiet moments arrived when power belts slipped or boilers required maintenance. In these cramped workshops, Granville observed how adult men spoke about their work and their injuries. Coarse jokes mixed with blunt accounts of accidents. One man described a co-worker who had lost several fingers when a coupling pin jammed and trapped his hand between moving parts. Another mentioned a boiler that had burst on a distant line, throwing scalding water and fragments of iron into a crew that had no safe direction to run. Stories circulated about night trains that overran signals in fog or snow, colliding with oncoming locomotives or plunging into washed-out bridges. The men told these tales in flat tones, sometimes with a bitter laugh or a curse directed at managers who refused to invest in safer systems. Granville listened closely and asked questions when it was safe to do so. He wanted to know why particular components failed, why brakes did not hold, and why crews failed to receive warnings. Older workers were sometimes impatient with a boy's curiosity, yet a few recognized his seriousness and explained that misaligned parts, worn bolts, or warped rods could cause sudden failure even in engines that had passed inspection. Others blamed dispatchers who sent trains onto single-track segments without clear confirmation that the line was clear. In these early conversations, Granville absorbed a core idea that would shape his adult work, that mechanical strength and accurate information were both necessary to keep trains from killing the people who operated them. The owners of the small machine shops valued stamina more than comfort. Workdays stretched from early light until long after dusk, and breaks were brief. The heat from forges and boilers soaked the air during summer, and in winter men worked in heavy coats while cold crept in through cracked windows and ill-fitting doors. Safety guards on rotating shafts and belts were rare, and it was common for apprentices to acquire scars from flying chips of metal or accidental contact with hot surfaces. When someone suffered a serious injury, the shop might close briefly out of respect, but wages stopped, and the injured worker often had to rely on family or church aid. Despite the strain, Granville recognized the machine shop as a kind of school that offered instruction unavailable anywhere else to a black boy in Columbus. A master machinist showed him how to set work square in a vise, how to read the subtle change in sound when a drill bit began to dull, and how to gauge the tolerance between moving parts by feel. Granville learned to heat and bend iron on the forge, to hammer it into precise forms, and to temper steel so that it remained hard without becoming brittle. He studied the patterns of wear on broken components, tracing scratches and deformation marks with his fingertips to understand where stress had concentrated. As he gained competence, he moved from sweeping and carrying to performing actual repair tasks. A foreman might hand him a cracked bracket from a locomotive and instruct him to clean it, bevel the edges, and prepare it for welding or replacement. Granville approached each assignment with unusual focus, conscious that the part would return to a train that would travel at speed over uneven track with human beings on board. His co-workers noticed that he avoided shortcuts even when pressed, and that he remained calm under the pressure of rush orders from the rail yards. Outside the workshops, Columbus continued to change under the influence of expanding rail traffic. New lines connected the city to additional markets, and trains carried manufactured goods, livestock, and passengers through the region in ever greater numbers. Telegraph offices near major stations transmitted messages in Morse code along wires that paralleled the tracks, allowing dispatchers to send train orders across distances that horses or messengers could not cover in time. However, the benefits of this communication network did not reach every part of the system evenly. Smaller stations suffered delays when lines were busy, and crews on moving trains received information only when they stopped or passed designated points. Granville saw the telegraph from the outside at first. Operators worked in rooms that boys from the shops were not invited to enter, and the code they tapped out on keys remained mysterious. Yet even from the sidewalk, he could see that the clatter of the instruments represented authority. Station agents and dispatchers carried themselves with the confidence of men whose decisions sent trains into motion or held them at sidings. When news broke of major collisions in other states, newspapers often mentioned confusion in orders or misunderstood signals, confirming for Granville that information could fail in ways that no amount of mechanical skill could repair after the fact. The social environment around him reinforced other limitations. Columbus offered few paths for a black youth to move into management or professional ranks. When Granville considered what he had seen among older men, the likely futures appeared narrow. Many seasoned workers remained in the same shops for decades, their bodies worn down by heavy labor and exposure to dirt and noise. Some drank heavily in the evenings to dull pain and regret. Hardly any could point to savings or security. Yet Granville also observed that men who mastered specialized skills sometimes commanded slightly better pay and a degree of respect even from prejudiced employers. These observations fed his desire to deepen his understanding of machinery and eventually electricity. He saved small portions of his wages to purchase second-hand technical books and pamphlets when he found them in used stalls. Some texts described steam engines, others covered basic electrical circuits and telegraph apparatus. Reading after long shifts was difficult as fatigue pulled at his eyelids, yet he pushed through page after page, annotating margins and copying diagrams to internalize the details. Concepts that confused him at first, such as resistance, current, and magnetic fields, gradually became clearer as he compared the printed explanations to the practical effects he saw in the shop. The years of his adolescence unfolded against a national backdrop of Reconstruction and its collapse. Political debates in distant capitals barely touched daily routines in Columbus, but the consequences of policy shifts reached black communities through tightening segregation, violent backlash in many regions, and persistent economic exclusion. Granville heard older residents discuss racist attacks in nearby towns and discriminatory hiring practices that kept qualified black workers out of skilled positions. These stories made it clear that talent alone would not guarantee opportunity, and that any advancement he carved out would meet resistance. As he approached his later teens, Granville's increased skill and reliability brought him more varied assignments. Shop owners and foremen began to trust him with measuring and fitting jobs that demanded precision, not just brute strength. He might be asked to rebuild a valve assembly, align wheel bearings, or check the condition of brake components that had seen heavy service. Each new task expanded his understanding of how the entire locomotive functioned, from firebox and boiler to wheels and couplers. He started to think of the engine not as a collection of unrelated parts, but as an interconnected system in which failure in one area could lead to disaster. Knowing this, he paid attention whenever mechanics or crewmen discussed incidents on the line. A brakeman might recount how a train nearly overshot a siding because a message about a meet had arrived late, forcing the engineer to brake harder than usual on wet rails. Another worker might report that a freight train had struck a wagon at a grade, crossing where warning systems were crude or non-existent. Granville quietly sorted these accounts into categories in his mind, distinguishing between failures rooted in human carelessness, those caused by poor equipment, and those tied to gaps in communication. In that same period, he began to hear about opportunities beyond Columbus. The Danville and Southern Railroad in Missouri needed firemen and junior crew for its locomotives, positions that offered higher pay than most shop work and direct experience with train operations. For a young man bound to the city's industrial wards since childhood, the prospect of travel and advancement held strong appeal. Such a move also promised a partial escape from the narrow perceptions that many in Columbus held of him as a permanent subordinate. The decision to leave was not easy. His parents depended on his wages, and distance would make support more uncertain. Yet he reasoned that a more responsible position on a railroad could eventually bring higher earnings than any long-term shop job. Granville discussed the opportunity with Martha and Cyrus over multiple evenings, presenting it not as a bid for independence but as a calculated step toward greater security for the entire family. They worried about the dangers of rail work, knowing that fires, collisions, and other mishaps could end a life in an instant. Yet they also recognized that opportunities seldom appeared twice for young black men in their position. In preparation for the move, Granville redoubled his efforts at both work and study. He sought extra shifts to build a small reserve of money, and he continued reading about locomotive design and basic electrical principles. He also paid close attention to any information he could gather about railroad dispatching and telegraph procedures, asking questions whenever he encountered a cooperative telegraph operator or station agent. Although he did not yet have access to formal training in these areas, he understood that knowledge of how messages moved along the wire could one day prove as valuable as his skill with a hammer and file. When the time came to depart, he packed his belongings into a modest bundle, mostly work clothes and a few cherished books. He said farewell to his parents and siblings, aware that he might not see them for long periods once he joined a mobile crew whose routes extended across states. The walk to the station where he would board his westbound train carried him past the machine shops that had shaped his youth. He heard familiar sounds of cutting and hammering as he passed, yet his thoughts were already on the locomotive cab he hoped to occupy, where he would feed coal to a firebox and feel directly the response of the engine beneath his feet. As the train pulled out of Columbus, Granville stood in the car corridor and watched the city recede. Telegraph poles stood in a straight row alongside the track, wires sagging slightly between them, forming a visible line that ran toward the horizon. He knew that those wires carried signals between distant points, that they linked dispatchers, stations, and offices in other towns. What they did not yet do was speak clearly to the crews aboard moving trains. That gap between stationary knowledge and onboard ignorance, glimpsed in countless shop floor stories and half-understood telegraph conversations, accompanied him as he headed toward Missouri and the next phase of his life on the rails. In the late spring of 1872, Granville Taylor Woods stood on the cinder-covered ground outside a Danville and Southern locomotive in Missouri, while the road foreman explained the expectations for a fireman who wanted to keep his job and keep his life. The engine hissed beside them with a steady exhaust, safety valve feathering steam into the air, while coal dust floated in a low haze around the yard. Woods had left the machine shops of Columbus behind him, and now faced work that would take place in motion, among moving cars and unpredictable track, under men who judged him both as a young worker and as a black man in a trade where prejudice was common and mercy was rare. His duties were clear and unforgiving. A fireman on that line was responsible for keeping the boiler fed, the water level safe, and the firebox hot enough to pull heavy trains over grades without letting pressure fall. He would shovel coal from the tender into the firebox until his shoulders burned, then adjust the dampers and watch the color of the flame through the open door. He had to keep an eye on the water glass, gauge cocks, and pressure gauge while the locomotive swayed and jolted under his feet. If he allowed the water level to drop too low, boiler plates could overheat and crack. If he overfilled, priming could carry water into the cylinders and hammer them to pieces. The engineer watched him closely on early runs, judging whether the new fireman could keep steam up and follow signals without error. The cab itself was a cramped metal box with open sides, hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Coal dust and ash blew in through every gap, mixing with sweat until skin and clothing turned into a sticky, dark layer that water alone could not quickly remove. The motion of the locomotive forced Woods to brace his legs at all times, especially when the train struck rough joints or took sharp curves. There were no enclosed vestibules or cushioned seats to ease the ride. A fireman used whatever handhold he could find while moving between the fire door and the tender, conscious that a misstep could send him out of the cab onto the ballast or under the wheels. Signals from trackside posts, telegraph operators, and station agents defined the legal path of the train, yet the crew in the cab often had only a partial picture of conditions ahead. Train orders were handed up at depots by men who stood near the track with hoops or sticks holding paper messages. The engineer and fireman reached out and caught these as they rolled past, glancing quickly at the contents and tucking them into the cab. Those orders described meets with opposing trains, slow orders over damaged track, or instructions to take sidings, but they could not report sudden washouts, broken rails, or wagons stalled on crossings that lay beyond the next bend. Woods listened when engineers cursed confusing handwriting or poorly phrased instructions, and he thought about the gap between what dispatchers knew in their offices and what crews experienced on the line. The physical risks of the job were visible everywhere. In the yards, brakemen moved between cars to set handbrakes or pull pins, their bodies inches from couplers that could slam together without warning if an engineer misjudged a shove. Switchmen walked along icy ties in winter with lanterns, trying to avoid slips that could send them beneath rolling wheels. Stories circulated among crews about men who had been crushed, burned, or scalded. Accident notices in newspapers described collisions and derailments in Missouri and neighboring states with numbing regularity. Official statistics compiled later in the century would confirm what railroaders already knew from experience: that worker injury and death rates on American railroads were shockingly high, especially among train crews who handled moving equipment and heavy loads. Woods absorbed these accounts without outward display, but they sharpened his sense that machines and procedures needed improvement if men were to stop dying in such numbers. He already understood metal from his years in Ohio, yet here he saw how even well-made parts could not compensate for poor information or flawed rules. An engineer might run on time according to a printed timetable while another train approached on the same track under a special order that the first crew had never seen. A telegraph operator might miscopy a figure or a word in haste. Fog, rain, or snow could hide signals until a locomotive was too close to stop. In that world, fate often appeared to rest on guesses and incomplete knowledge rather than on firm facts. Daily work left little room for reflection during the hours on duty. Each trip demanded constant attention to the track ahead, the state of the fire, and the condition of the machinery. Woods learned to listen to bearings and rods, noting changes in sound that suggested overheating or wear. He checked the journals at stops, feeling for excessive warmth that might precede a hot box and a possible derailment. At water tanks, he helped the engineer align the locomotive under spouts, then opened valves to refill the tender while scanning the sky for signs of approaching storms that could wash out fills or undermine trestles. When trains halted at small stations, he watched the activity on the platform, noticing the telegraph instruments clicking inside offices and the calm or anxiety on the faces of station staff. The prejudice that shaped work in Missouri added another layer of strain. White crewmen sometimes questioned his presence in the cab or muttered slurs when they thought he could not hear over the engine noise. Supervisors held his mistakes against him more harshly than they did those of others, and any sign of fatigue risked being interpreted as weakness. Woods responded by mastering every aspect of his responsibility so thoroughly that even hostile co-workers had to admit his competence. Over time, engineers who had first doubted him came to rely on his steady firing and careful observation, because an engine that kept time and avoided trouble reflected well on everyone aboard. Promotions in that environment came slowly, but they did arrive. After months of reliable service, Woods began to take on more duties that overlapped with those of the engineer. He learned to read the road, memorizing grades, curves, and troublesome spots where rails tended to shift or where livestock strayed onto the right-of-way. Under supervision, he placed his hands on the throttle and brake valve, feeling the weight of the train behind him. On straight stretches with clear signals and light traffic, the engineer sometimes let him handle the run while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. These experiences taught Woods how to judge stopping distances, how to manage slack in long freight consists, and how quickly a miscalculation in speed or braking could escalate into a dangerous situation. Life between runs did not offer much comfort. Crews often slept in basic lodging near terminals, in rooms that smelled of old smoke and sweat. Meals were hurried affairs eaten in trackside diners or boarding houses, with little time for rest before the next call. Pay was modest compared to risk. Woods used his scarce free hours not only to recover but also to continue the pattern of self-study he had already begun in Ohio. He purchased or borrowed technical manuals on locomotives and on the telegraph, turning pages slowly under dim light while other men gambled or drank in nearby saloons. By 1874, after a period of service in the cab, Woods decided to leave the Danville and Southern and move to Springfield, Illinois to work in a rolling mill. The Springfield Iron Works offered a different kind of industrial environment, one centered on the mass production of rails and other heavy sections rather than on their use in the field. Inside the mill, open furnaces glowed with white heat, feeding red-hot billets into rolling stands where they were squeezed and elongated between massive rotating rolls. The noise inside the building was continuous and punishing, a blend of metal striking metal, steam vents, shouting workers, and clattering machinery. Woods joined the crews who handled this process, applying his growing knowledge of metallurgy and mechanics to the tasks at hand. He monitored furnace conditions, helped adjust rolls, and inspected finished rails for visible defects. In the mill, he saw how small flaws in steel could grow into dangerous weaknesses once rails were laid under trains. Cracks, inclusions, or improper cooling could lead to breaks under repeated stress. In conversations with fellow workers and supervisors, he heard of rails that had failed in service, dropping wheels into gaps and derailing entire trains. These accounts reinforced his understanding that safety on the railroad depended as much on the quality of components produced in distant mills as on the skill of crews in the cab. The rolling mill had its own brutal hazards. Workers moved heavy ingots with tongs and hooks, remaining only a misstep away from contact with hot metal that could burn flesh to the bone. Mechanical guards were minimal or absent. Men lost fingers and limbs when they were caught in rolls or pinched between moving parts. Overhead cranes carried loads that could crush anyone beneath them if a chain failed. The atmosphere was thick with heat and dust, and lungs filled with fine particles that would linger for years. Woods took note not only of the immediate dangers, but also of the way long exposure to such conditions wore men down prematurely. Despite the physical strain, the Springfield period offered Woods a chance to deepen his formal understanding of engineering. Sources from his era record that he pursued college-level instruction in mechanical and electrical engineering between 1876 and 1878, though the exact institution remains unclear. After long shifts at the mill, he attended classes or private lessons where instructors introduced the theoretical foundations underlying the machines he serviced. In those sessions, he studied principles of thermodynamics, the behavior of steam under pressure, the mathematics of mechanical advantage, and the basics of electrical circuits. This structured study gave him language and formulas to connect to observations he had already made on the railroad and in the mill. Concepts such as resistance, inductance, and capacitance presented on classroom blackboards linked to the telegraph systems he had seen lining the tracks. Lectures on stress and strain helped him understand why certain rail shapes perform better under heavy loads. Laboratory demonstrations using batteries, coils, and simple motors showed how electrical energy could be harnessed and controlled. Woods absorbed this material quickly, asking pointed questions and staying after class to examine apparatus more closely when permitted. As one of the few black students in any technical setting he entered, Woods encountered both curiosity and hostility. Some classmates regarded him as an anomaly, a worker from the mills who sought knowledge that many of them took for granted as their natural path. Others resented his presence and muttered about race when he answered questions correctly or performed well on examinations. Instructors varied in their responses. A few seemed genuinely interested in his progress, while others maintained a distant, formal attitude. Woods responded as he had on the railroad, focusing on performance rather than on the opinions of those who doubted him. Every correct calculation and successful experiment confirmed that his earlier self-directed study had prepared him for this more advanced work. By the late 1870s, he had combined years of practical experience with locomotives, exposure to the heavy industrial processes that produced rails, and a growing foundation in electrical engineering. That combination positioned him differently from many of his peers. Railroaders who had spent their entire careers in the cab often lacked familiarity with the science behind their tools, while engineers trained in classrooms sometimes had limited direct experience with the brutal realities of rail operations in industrial plants. Woods stood at the intersection carrying scars and memories from both worlds along with notebooks filled with equations and sketches. In 1878, seeking new challenges and better pay, Woods accepted a position aboard the British steamer Ironsides. The ship operated under British registry and employed crews from multiple nations. Yet discipline remained strict and hierarchies rigid. Woods joined the engineering department, initially in a subordinate role that required long hours in the engine room. There, enclosed metal surfaces amplified every sound from the machinery. Pistons moved in tall cylinders, connecting rods drove massive crankshafts, and linkages translated rotary motion into the thrust that drove the propeller. Boilers burned coal continuously, feeding steam to the engines through a network of pipes and valves that had to be tended and inspected without pause. Conditions in the engine room were harsh, even by the standards of the time. The air was hot and humid, thick with the smell of oil, steam, and coal smoke that had not been fully drawn off by ventilation. Lighting came from oil lamps or early electric fixtures that cast unsteady glows over metal surfaces slick with condensed moisture. Any slip on the grating could send a man into contact with moving parts. If a valve failed or a pipe burst, scalding steam could fill the space in seconds. The crew at the heart of the ship rarely saw the sky while on duty, yet they bore prime responsibility for keeping the vessel moving safely between ports. Communication at sea was even more limited than on the railroad. Once Ironsides left harbor, its officers depended on visual signals, flags, rockets, and occasional gunshots to communicate with other vessels. Weather forecasts were rudimentary, and information about hazards traveled only as fast as ships could carry it. If machinery failed in mid-ocean, there were no nearby workshops to call, no telegraph lines to carry pleas for assistance. The engineering staff had to diagnose and correct problems using whatever tools and materials they had on hand, guided by experience and by instinct sharpened through long exposure to the behavior of engines under load. Woods thrived in this demanding environment. He already understood steam engines from his time on the railroad, but marine machinery introduced new variables such as constant vibration, corrosion from salt water, and the need to balance power with fuel consumption over voyages that could last weeks. He learned to interpret the subtle changes in sound and feel that signaled trouble in bearings or valves. He also saw how even slight misalignments could grow into serious faults when a ship rolled in heavy seas. When the vessel entered storms, the engine room crew could feel each wave in the form of shifting loads and changing engine speeds, but they often received only minimal information about the scale of the weather system around them. Within roughly 2 years, Woods rose to the position of chief engineer on Ironsides. That promotion placed the full responsibility for the ship's machinery on his shoulders. He supervised maintenance schedules, assigned tasks to subordinates, and made critical decisions about when to slow engines to prevent damage and when to push them to keep to schedules or to escape threatening weather. The role demanded not only technical skill but also steady judgment under pressure, because mistakes could jeopardize lives and cargo. In this capacity, Woods also negotiated with captains and owners about needed repairs and upgrades, advocating for changes that would reduce the risk of mechanical failure. The combination of isolation and responsibility aboard Ironsides deepened his awareness of the value of reliable communication systems. When news of distant events reached the ship in port, it came through newspapers that were already days old, or through remarks from harbor officials. At sea, information about obstacles, storms, or other vessels was fragmentary and delayed. Woods could see a parallel between that situation and the gaps he had witnessed on the railroad, where crews moved under orders that did not always reflect real-time conditions. In both environments, people died when messages failed to reach the right place quickly enough. After his period as chief engineer, Woods chose to return to work on land. The precise reasons for his decision are not documented, but the move brought him back to Ohio with a wealth of experience that few others shared. He had seen locomotives pound along uneven track and steamships fight their way through rough seas. He had worked in machine shops, rolling mills, locomotive cabs, and ship engine rooms. He had studied engineering principles formally enough to tie his observations to theory. As he stepped off the ship and prepared to enter the next phase of his career, he carried with him a clear understanding of how much depended on mechanical reliability and on timely, accurate communication in any system that moved people and goods across long distances. In the early months of 1880, Granville Taylor Woods stood in the cab of a locomotive running between Washington Courthouse and Dayton, feeling the steady pull of the train as it climbed shallow grades across southwestern Ohio. The line crossed farm fields, small towns, and low river bottoms where winter thaw turned the right-of-way soft and unstable. As engineer, not fireman, he now watched every mile marker and signal mast, calculated stopping distances in his head, and thought constantly about the trains he could not see that shared his timetable. The telegraph poles that lined the track carried orders from dispatchers, yet once his locomotive left a station, he knew that no one could speak directly to him until the next stop, no matter what changed ahead. His skills at the throttle grew out of years of brutal work in cabs and mills and on shipboard machinery. Now, with his hands on the controls, he studied the limits of the system that surrounded him. Train orders were still copied by hand in dim telegraph offices, repeated aloud, then handed up on hoops as trains rolled past. Any mistake in transcription could send two trains toward each other. Heavy freight consists moved slowly on grades and could not easily clear a single track for opposing traffic. Even when every man did his best, fog, drifting snow, or sudden obstructions on the line could turn a routine run into a crisis before any message about danger could reach the moving locomotive. Newspaper accounts of collisions and derailments appeared regularly in Ohio papers. Woods read about head-on crashes where crews died in crushed cabs, and passengers were burned when wooden coaches splintered and caught fire under overturned stoves. Reports blamed human error, misunderstood orders, or the difficulty of keeping track of trains once they left terminals. While other readers shook their heads and moved on, he connected each story to his own experience at the controls and to the telegraph wires that shadowed the track without ever truly touching the locomotive. The idea formed that if those wires could somehow reach into the train while it moved, the worst gaps in information could be closed. His earlier study of electricity and magnetism returned to mind while he watched the line pass beneath the wheels. Coils, currents, and induced forces were no longer just classroom concepts. Here, telegraph lines carried changing currents every time a dispatcher or station operator sent a message. Those currents created electric fields around the wires. If a conductor inside a moving train could sense changes in that field and translate them into signals or even speech, the train would no longer be cut off from the fixed network whenever it rolled out of a station. The thought was simple in outline and complex in practice. It remained in his head for months as he made run after run, holding to schedules and obeying imperfect orders while imagining a different kind of communication link. That same year he turned toward Cincinnati, the largest city in the region and a center of industry where steam, metal, and electricity were already reshaping work. In June of 1880, he married Sadie Turner, an event recorded in the city's newspapers and directories, and took on new responsibilities outside the cab. The couple's address in the early records placed them near the intersection of Canal and Race, an area of cramped buildings and narrow streets where working families shared thin-walled rooms above shops and workshops. Smoke from factory chimneys mixed with river fog and drifted through the neighborhood, leaving dark streaks on brick facades and window glass. Street noise never fully stopped because freight wagons, draymen, and shift workers moved at all hours. Cincinnati's black community offered both refuge and strain. Segregation in schools, housing, and public accommodations persisted, but there were also churches, lodges, and mutual aid societies that gave residents a place to gather and plan. Wood's earlier connection to abolitionist and community leader David Jenkins in Columbus helped open doors to respected black educators and clergy in Cincinnati. Through Masonic circles and church contacts, he met men who taught in the city's colored schools, and others who had built successful businesses despite constant discrimination. They saw in him not just another skilled mechanic, but someone who deliberately studied advanced subjects and spoke about electricity with rare precision. By 1882, city directories listed Granville Woods on Fulton Street in the River Ward east of downtown. The district sloped steeply from hilltop neighborhoods down toward the Ohio River and the industrial flats. Houses clung to the hillside above breweries, machine shops, and rail yards. From his doorway, Woods could look down at smokestacks and switch yards and hear whistles echo through the valley at all hours. That position between residential streets and heavy industry mirrored his own balance between community life and the technical world. During the day, he moved among machinery and wires. At night, he returned to modest rooms in a black neighborhood where residents followed his progress and discussed his prospects. In Cincinnati, he opened a small machine and electrical shop, first as a modest operation and then as a growing enterprise that took on contract work. The space contained a workbench scarred by previous tenants, a lathe, a drill press, and racks of hand tools. On another table stood batteries in glass jars, coils of insulated wire, telegraph instruments, and experimental apparatus that he assembled and adjusted himself. Customers brought in motors for repair, requested wiring work for factories, and asked advice about the new telephone systems that a few businesses were beginning to install. Woods repaired contacts, rewound coils, and adjusted relays while listening to the concerns of owners who wanted more reliable power and clearer signals. Word spread among Cincinnati manufacturers that he could handle both mechanical and electrical problems. That combination distinguished him from many local tradesmen who specialized in only one area. Factories that used large stationary boilers and engines hired him to inspect firing arrangements and draft systems. Small telephone companies and businesses with private telegraph lines asked him to diagnose noise on their circuits and to advise on better instruments. Each job added to his understanding of how steam and electricity were being used in real workplaces and where those uses fell short. Steam boilers in particular drew his attention. Across the city, tall boiler houses supplied power to mills, printing plants, breweries, and machine works. Firemen fed coal through iron doors into cramped furnaces where thick smoke rolled through flues and up stacks. Inefficient combustion wasted fuel and left soot on buildings and in lungs. At times, poorly managed boilers exploded, tearing apart brick walls and killing workers who had little chance to escape. Trade journals and official reports recorded such disasters with blunt language, listing numbers of dead and injured and speculating on causes. Woods knew that any design that could deliver more complete combustion and safer operation would be valuable to owners and workers alike. He studied existing furnace layouts both in person and in drawings and concluded that the hot gases leaving the grate often passed too quickly over cooler surfaces of the boiler, losing heat before burning fully. The ordinary single-bridge wall behind the firebox did little to keep the gases in the hottest region, and draft was not always controlled well. In his notebooks, he sketched a modified furnace in which an additional wall of fire brick would stand behind the existing bridge wall, close to the lower contour of the boiler shell. Between these walls and the rear chamber, he envisioned a passage that would force gases to circulate in a tighter path and remain in contact with very hot surfaces. The concept that became his improved steam boiler furnace centered on that auxiliary wall and a set of carefully placed openings. He designed the supplementary bridge wall to rise from near the ash pit almost to the underside of the boiler, with a narrow space between its rear face and the metal shell. Through this wall, he pierced horizontal apertures slightly below the grate level. In front of the ordinary bridge wall, he placed a pipe with nozzles arranged to direct jets of steam or air backward through the apertures. When connected to the boiler's own steam supply, this pipe would send high-velocity jets through the openings to mix the partially burned gases and drive them toward a hot rear wall. In operation, the modified furnace behaved differently from traditional arrangements. The jets from the blast pipe whipped the combustion gases into turbulent motion and forced them through the apertures, against the heated masonry beyond. That motion brought unburned fragments of fuel into closer contact with oxygen, raising temperatures to a level where complete combustion was more likely. At the same time, the layout pulled cooler gases that had brushed the boiler shell at the rear back down between the auxiliary wall and the boiler, reheating them before they returned through the apertures. The arrangement allowed the furnace to maintain a hotter flame zone under the boiler, while reducing the tendency of cooler shell surfaces to quench combustion by keeping the hottest gases away from direct contact with the comparatively cooler metal surface of the boiler for a longer portion of their path. Woods's design aimed to conserve heat in the flame itself rather than dumping it prematurely into the water. The partial vacuum produced by the jets ahead of the auxiliary wall helped to draw gases from the rear into the high-temperature region again. The overall effect, as he described it in his specification, was to increase efficiency, reduce smoke, and improve fuel economy without requiring a complete replacement of existing boilers. Owners could retrofit the wall and piping into their current settings, a practical consideration that increased the likelihood of adoption. On June 19, 1883, he submitted his application for the steam boiler furnace to the United States Patent Office, with his address listed as Cincinnati, Ohio. The process required detailed drawings and precise language explaining both structure and mode of operation. He worked with a patent attorney familiar with such filings, but the technical content remained his own. Every line of the specification reflected his ability to move from physical problems in boiler rooms to abstract descriptions that examiners in Washington could evaluate. Months passed while the patent office reviewed the claims, compared them to previous designs, and determined whether his arrangement was distinct. On June 3, 1884, the patent issued under the number that identified his first legally recognized invention. The document named him as a citizen of the United States residing in Cincinnati and credited him with new and useful improvements in steam boiler furnaces. For a black engineer in a city and nation that routinely denied people of his race basic rights, that official recognition carried meaning beyond its commercial value. It confirmed that his ideas could stand in the same legal framework that protected the work of famous white inventors. Business partners and newspaper writers now had an official record to point to when they assessed his abilities. The immediate financial impact of the furnace patent was modest. Some factory owners saw value in improved fuel economy, yet many hesitated to invest in alterations unless rising coal prices or repeated smoke complaints forced change. Still, the patent strengthened Wood's position when approaching investors and clients. It proved that he could conceive, document, and defend a complex mechanical improvement. It also gave him experience with patent procedures that he would later draw on when protecting more ambitious electrical inventions. During these same years, he increased the electrical side of his work. Cincinnati businesses began installing telephone lines within buildings and between offices. Telegraph offices handled heavy traffic as railroads, merchants, and newspapers relied on rapid messages. In his shop, Woods worked on transmitters, receivers, and relays, improving contacts and coils so that signals would carry more clearly over long circuits. He experimented with different diaphragm materials, armature shapes, and magnetic arrangements, learning how small changes in construction affected clarity of sound and responsiveness to weak currents. Those experiments led naturally to questions about how best to share wires between different kinds of messages. Telegraph systems used pulses of current to produce clicks and sounders that trained operators translated into letters. Telephone systems used continuous variations in current to reproduce speech at a distance. Maintaining separate lines for each purpose increased cost. Woods began to develop an apparatus that could handle both forms on the same wire, switching between Morse signals and voice without constant rewiring. He considered how to design keys, sounders, and diaphragms so that they could respond appropriately under different operating modes, and how to arrange circuits so that the same physical line could carry either type of communication as conditions required. The same curiosity that drove those combined telephone and telegraph experiments also kept him focused on moving trains. He had not forgotten the vision that came during his runs between Washington Courthouse and Dayton. In spare hours, he returned to sketches and notes about inductive communication, now enriched by hands-on experience with coils and telegraph instruments. In his Cincinnati shop, he had access to telegraph lines, batteries, and measuring devices that he could use to turn a rough concept into workable apparatus. By the eve of his second major patent, he held in his mind a cluster of related ideas, all aimed at closing dangerous gaps in communication and making better use of existing wires. His first patent in 1884 marked only the beginning of that effort. In early 1884, the workshop on Fulton Avenue in Cincinnati held an unusual mix of objects for a small business, heavy machine tools in one corner, and in another glass jars of battery acid, coils of insulated wire, and experimental telephone parts laid out on scarred planks. Outside, wagons rattled over uneven cobblestones and smoke from riverfront industries drifted past the windows. But inside, Granville Woods focused on the delicate interactions of diaphragm, coil, and contact point. The first patent for his improved furnace had given him a foothold among manufacturers, yet his mind had already shifted from fireboxes to wires. He wanted to find a way for a single circuit to carry both the dots and dashes of Morse code and the continuous motion of human speech, so that one line could do the work of two without constant rewiring. The demand for such a device was real and immediate. Telegraph offices across Cincinnati and along the railroads were busy from morning until night, their operators translating a constant stream of clicks into written words. Telephone instruments, while still scarce compared to telegraph keys, had begun to appear in business districts, linking factories, warehouses, and wholesalers to one another. Each system had its own equipment and often its own lines, and the companies that controlled those lines charged significant fees for installation and use. Woods heard complaints from small firms that could not afford separate wires for every service, and from railroad agents who wanted both the speed of telegraph signals and the clarity of spoken instructions without the cost of additional circuits. In his shop, Woods had already built and repaired ordinary telephone transmitters which used a vibrating diaphragm and variable resistance contact to turn sound waves into electrical changes. He had also spent years working with telegraph keys and sounders that responded only to distinct closures and openings of a circuit. The challenge before him was to design an apparatus that could serve both modes, shifting between them quickly and reliably, while still being simple enough for practical use by station clerks and factory staff who did not have advanced technical training. He began with the finger key, the humble telegraph instrument that operators used to send coded messages. In conventional form, it simply made and broke the circuit as the operator pressed and released the lever. Woods redesigned the key so that in one position it would act in that familiar way for Morse operation, and in another, it would function as part of a microphone-style transmitter for voice. He fit a soft iron diaphragm into a frame and arranged contacts of carbon and metal so that the pressure of sound waves on the diaphragm would alter the resistance of the circuit rather than completely interrupting it. By adjusting screws and springs, he created a mechanism that could either snap cleanly for telegraphy or respond sensitively to vibration for telephony. He did not stop at the transmitter. On the receiving end, ordinary telegraph sounders were built to react to relatively strong, well-defined current pulses. They would not move properly under the weaker, more subtle fluctuations used in telephone work. Woods devised a receiver with two coils around a magnetic core, a fine wire coil intended for the light currents associated with speech and a coarser coil for the stronger pulses used in regular telegraphy. By arranging these coils concentrically on a permanent magnet and connecting them through a switchable circuit, he gave a single instrument the ability to respond properly in both operating modes. Connecting these elements was a commutator that allowed the operator to rearrange the circuit without physically rerouting wires. With one setting of the switches, the line current flowed through the coarse coil and the key acted like a standard telegraph key, sending pulses down the wire to be heard as clicks in the distant sounder. With another setting, the fine coil came into play. The transmitter contacts closed into a sensitive arrangement, and the same line carried induced currents that mirrored the pattern of spoken words near the key. A trained operator could thus choose whether to send coded or spoken messages within moments, depending on the situation, without leaving the instrument or altering the external line. Testing this system required patience and careful measurement rather than the violent pressures that had defined Woods's earlier work in locomotives and mills. He recruited assistants from among acquaintances who could be trusted to keep experiments quiet while he refined contact pressure, coil windings, and switch positions. In one trial, he set up two stations at opposite ends of his shop, connected by a simple wire that ran along the wall. They first sent Morse signals back and forth to confirm that the basic telegraph mode worked as expected. Then Woods shifted the settings and spoke aloud near the transmitter, while his assistant pressed his ear beside the receiver diaphragm. At first, the sound was faint and distorted, words lost in a hiss of background noise. Woods adjusted the springs that held the key contacts together, tuned the tension on the diaphragm, and altered the number of turns in the fine coil, each change driven by observation rather than guesswork. After hours of incremental refinement, the assistant reported that syllables had become distinct and that Woods's voice could be recognized rather than merely heard as a murmur. They repeated the trial many times, swapping positions and testing different line lengths as they extended wires into neighboring rooms. Even in the confines of the workshop, it was clear that the device could transmit both Morse code and speech over the same circuit when properly set. Outside the controlled space of his shop, the environment posed greater challenges. Commercial telegraph lines ran through crowded streets and past sources of electrical interference such as other circuits, lightning arresters, and stray leakage from poorly insulated connections. Woods understood that any practical apparatus had to function over such lines, not just over short, clean runs of wire between tables. He approached cooperative telegraph operators in Cincinnati, men who had come to respect his ability to repair instruments quickly, and asked for permission to experiment on side circuits when traffic was light. In off-peak hours, he and these operators connected his apparatus to spare wires and tried sending both types of messages between their offices and his workshop. Operators who had spent careers deciphering code were skeptical about the value of voice communication over lines built for telegraphy, but curiosity led some to participate. They worked through the same series of adjustments that Woods had performed in the shop, testing how far speech could travel before fading into unintelligible noise. These field tests confirmed his belief that with careful circuit design and appropriate switching, the existing infrastructure could carry dual-purpose signals. While the technical challenges occupied his days and nights, the business realities of patenting and marketing the invention weighed on him as well. Woods had learned from his furnace patent that a sound technical design did not automatically bring widespread adoption or serious income. He knew that the telegraph and telephone fields were dominated by powerful companies with their own research departments and patent portfolios. If he filed too narrow a claim, others might design around his work. If he filed too broad a claim, examiners might reject it for overlapping previous patents. He needed to describe his system with enough detail to prove that it was distinct, yet in terms broad enough to protect its key features. In April 1884, he submitted his application for a system and apparatus for the transmission and reception of messages by electricity, describing in exact language how his modified key, dual-coil receiver, and commutator worked together. He referred to the system with a new term, telegraphony, to emphasize that it united telegraph and telephone functions in one practical scheme. The application listed his Cincinnati address and identified him as the inventor, using the same formal opening formula that appeared in patents issued to widely known white inventors of the period. He studied each line of the draft with his patent attorney, correcting phrasing until it captured both the mechanical structure and the operational advantages without ambiguity. Then he waited. Months passed while the United States Patent Office examined his submission. During that time, business at his shop continued, with repair orders and small installation projects paying immediate bills. Yet whenever a telegraph line crackled overhead or a new telephone instrument appeared on a client's desk, he thought about the apparatus described in his application and wondered how soon he would know the official outcome. For a black inventor working without corporate backing, a favorable decision would represent not just a legal milestone, but a shield against theft by those who might otherwise seize his ideas without compensation. On April 7, 1885, word arrived that the patent had been granted under number 315,368. The document acknowledged his description of a combined system capable of carrying both signal and spoken messages over the same line. In practical terms, it confirmed that no prior patent matched his arrangement closely enough to block his claims. Woods now held legal recognition that telegraphony, as he defined it, belonged to him. He obtained certified copies of the patent and filed them carefully, aware that these pages could form the basis for negotiations with companies that controlled much of the nation's long-distance wiring. Among those companies, the American Bell Telephone Company of Boston occupied a position of particular importance. Bell and its affiliates owned a large share of the telephone network and were actively seeking improvements that could increase the efficiency and profitability of their lines. News of Woods's patent reached executives and engineers who followed developments in electrical communication through technical journals and patent bulletins. They recognized that a device capable of handling both telegraph and telephone traffic over a single wire could reduce infrastructure costs and open new markets, especially in smaller towns that could not justify separate lines. Negotiations followed between Woods and representatives of American Bell, conducted through correspondence and in-person meetings. For Woods, these discussions involved more than technical evaluation. They required him to assert the value of his work in rooms where black inventors were seldom seen. He brought with him detailed diagrams, descriptions of tests conducted on Cincinnati lines, and demonstrations of the apparatus when facilities allowed. Company experts examined his device, questioned him about its limitations, and considered how it might integrate into their existing systems. The outcome of these talks was a purchase of the rights to the telegraphy patent by American Bell. The company obtained control over the use of the invention in its networks, while Woods received payment that greatly exceeded what he had earned from the furnace patent. The exact figure does not survive in surviving public records, but contemporary descriptions characterize the compensation as generous enough to support him as a full-time inventor for a period. That income allowed him to step back from some of the day-to-day service work that had previously filled his schedule and to devote more hours to research. This success carried both practical and symbolic weight in the Cincinnati black community. Newspapers that catered to black readers reported that a local electrician and engineer of their race had developed a communication system valuable enough for a major national company to purchase. Church members and lodge brothers who had followed his progress for years saw the sale as proof that careful study and persistence could overcome, at least in part, the barriers erected by prejudice. Young men interested in technical work suddenly had a living example in their own city of someone who had turned apprenticeship, self-education, and disciplined experimentation into recognized invention. Yet Woods himself did not treat telegraphy as an endpoint. He considered it one step toward wider changes in how messages moved through the rail and communication networks. The patent had proven that authorities in Washington and decision-makers in Boston would accept new ideas from him when he presented them in solid technical form. It had also given him insight into how large companies examined, valued, and absorbed independent inventions. He now understood that any future system he offered would face scrutiny not only for its technical merits but also for its compatibility with existing equipment and its potential effect on established revenue streams. At the bench in his Cincinnati workshop, he returned to the coils and circuits that had been his tools for years. Telegraphy had taught him how to manage different types of electrical signals on a shared wire and how to use switching arrangements to route currents through separate coils as needed. Those same concepts of multiplexing and selective induction suggested ways to send messages to and from conductors that were not physically connected by the wire at all. Woods knew that telegraph lines along railroad tracks formed extended electromagnetic fields around themselves whenever they carried current. He began once more to sketch schemes in which a coil mounted below a rail car might interact with that field, strongly enough to allow messages to pass without direct contact. For the moment, however, telegraphy defined his public reputation among those outside the railroad industry. In patent abstracts, he appeared as the Cincinnati-based inventor who had merged the telegraph office and the telephone exchange in a single system. In trade discussions, his name entered conversations about how to make better use of crowded rights-of-way and limited wire resources. Each of these references reinforced the fact that by 1885, Granville Taylor Woods had moved firmly into the ranks of recognized electrical inventors armed with experience, legal protection, and a growing sense of how far wireless communication between moving trains and fixed stations might yet be pushed. In January of 1885, ice lined the curbs of Cincinnati streets while smoke from riverfront stacks hung low over the valley. And inside a quiet corner of a reading room on Vine Street, Granville Taylor Woods sat with a fresh issue of Scientific American spread out before him. The long table at which he worked held newspapers and journals from various cities, their pages crinkled and smudged by many hands, but his attention centered on a column that described an experimental system for telegraphing to moving trains without a direct contact. The article named its originator as Lucius J. Phelps, an inventor working on what the editors called an induction railway telegraph. The printed description was plain and mechanical rather than sensational, yet the implications were extreme. Phelps's design placed insulated conductors along the railway line, either overhead or beside the track driven by a telegraph circuit on the ground. A corresponding conductor on the moving train ran close enough to the fixed wires that currents in one could induce related currents in the other. In principle, signals sent from a station into the line would appear in the apparatus aboard the passing train, and messages from the train could be detected in receiving coils at fixed points. Woods read the passage once, then again, tracing the circuit in his mind step by step. The idea did not surprise him in a general sense. He understood induction from his own studies and from the behavior of coils in telegraph and telephone work. What struck him was the explicit proposal to use that effect to reach trains in motion along active lines. Until that moment, most of his thoughts about rail communication had followed the familiar pattern of wires attached to poles and instruments anchored in offices. The train remained a separate unit of iron and wood that entered and left the area of telegraphic control only when it passed a station. Phelps's system treated the moving vehicles as part of the circuit even while they rolled between depots. As he read, he noted that the article presented the induction railway telegraph as a notable curiosity rather than as a finished solution. The piece mentioned successful trials over limited distances with trains fitted with special apparatus receiving and acknowledging messages from wayside stations. It did not claim that the system had been adopted broadly, or that major rail companies were redesigning their lines around it. Woods studied the wording carefully and saw hints of hesitation. The editors praised the ingenuity of the scheme yet left unstated questions about cost, interference between adjacent tracks, and the behavior of the system when multiple trains occupied the same section of line. He folded the journal closed for a moment and looked around the reading room. A coal stove near the wall radiated steady heat, and a clerk behind a high desk stamped return dates into other volumes. Outside, wagon wheels clattered over. Frozen ruts and the faint sound of a distant train whistle drifted up from the direction of the river. The contrast between the everyday surroundings and the description he had just read sharpened his focus. On the streets and in the yards, men still risked their lives every day under the current system of timetables, fixed signals, and telegraphed orders handled only at stations. Inside the journal, someone had shown that it was technically possible to send information directly to a moving train. He opened the issue again and copied the key details into his own notebook, recording Phelps's name, the basic layout of the conductors, and the claimed results of early tests. He added questions in the margins as he wrote. How strong were the induced currents at useful distances? How did the system perform in heavy rain or snow? What happened when parallel lines ran close together and induced stray signals into each other? Could the same physical conductor serve both ordinary telegraph traffic and the special train communication signals without confusion? Each question pointed toward practical obstacles that would have to be overcome before any induction-based system could protect crews and passengers on crowded lines. His mind went back to the head-on collisions and rear-end crashes described in newspapers over the previous decade. Some had occurred after telegraph operators miscopied orders. Others had stemmed from the inability of dispatchers to warn trains already in motion about sudden changes, such as a bridge washed out by a flash flood or a stalled freight train blocking a line beyond a curve. He pictured engineers staring into darkness or blowing snow, relying on whistle signals, lanterns, and memory of written orders. If those men could have received a clear warning while still miles away rather than only at the next station, many lives would have been saved. The article in front of him argued that such warnings were not a fantasy but a reachable goal. Leaving the reading room, he walked back through streets coated in a mixture of soot and snow, passing shop windows fogged from interior warmth and street lamps that flickered in the icy air. The telegraph poles that lined the avenues carried wires to offices that he knew well. Inside those rooms, operators listened to a constant stream of code that rarely mentioned the moving trains directly except when transmitting orders tied to specific scheduled stops. He imagined those same wires feeding into induction coils that ran along rights of way, sending coded or spoken warnings down entire stretches of track without waiting for trains to reach individual depots. Back in his Fulton Street workshop, he laid the notebook on his bench beside telegraph instruments, batteries, and coils assembled for other projects. The room smelled of shellac, hot metal, and cold tobacco smoke. Outside, the noise of wagon traffic washed in through thin walls. But inside, he controlled the arrangement of tools and apparatus. He opened the notebook to the page where he had copied the description of Phelps's system and began to sketch variations. In place of a single overhead or roadside conductor, he drew paired inductive circuits, one tied directly into existing telegraph lines and another shaped to run under or beside rail cars. He considered signal strength first. The currents available on standard telegraph lines were limited, and any induced current in the train apparatus would be weaker still. If the receiving coil on the train was too small or placed too far from the fixed conductor, the useful signal would be lost in background noise and natural electrical disturbances. On the other hand, if the apparatus required too large a coil or cumbersome frame, rail companies would balk at the cost and inconvenience of fitting it to every car. He made notes about coil dimensions, distances from track to apparatus, and the effects of different frequencies of signaling current on inductive coupling. He also confronted the problem of multiple trains in proximity. On busy lines, more than one train might occupy a section between major stations, especially where sidings and branch lines created complex patterns of movement. A crude induction system might simply broadcast the same signal to every train in range, leaving crews to determine which orders applied to them. That approach risked confusion and errors, particularly in bad weather or at night. Wood sought a method that would allow a train to receive information relevant to its own movement without being overwhelmed by general traffic. His thinking turned towards synchronized circuits and selective signaling, techniques that he had begun to explore while working on telegraphony. From his experience with combined telegraph and telephone systems, he knew that multiple forms of information could share a conductor if managed correctly. Telegraphony had shown that pulses and continuous variations could occupy the same line, provided that instruments at each end were correctly matched and that switching allowed the user to choose the mode. Applying a similar principle to rail communication, he imagined a system in which the induction apparatus on a train would tune itself to particular currents in the fixed line, responding strongly only to patterns associated with its own number or class of train. The term synchronous entered his notes as he thought about how to align sending and receiving circuits in time and frequency. On another page, he sketched the cross-section of a railway line, with rails, ties, and ballast drawn in plain pencil lines. Above the right-of-way, he drew telegraph poles and wires as they already existed across much of the country. Between them, he added a new element, a loop or helical conductor mounted close to the track, connected through transformers and switches to the telegraph line. Below the floor of a rail car, he placed a corresponding coil shaped so that its motions relative to the fixed conductor would maximize mutual induction as the train rolled. He imagined the train's coil mounted in a protective frame that could withstand vibration, moisture, and dirt without losing its electrical properties. He thought in concrete terms about how dispatchers and crews would use such a system. A dispatcher at a central office would still sit at a key or speaking instrument, connected to the telegraph network. When a dangerous condition arose, such as a break in the track ahead or an unexpected obstruction, the dispatcher would send a warning message into the line, not simply addressed to a station, but injected into an induction circuit running alongside the affected stretch of track. As trains passed through that zone, their undercar coils would pick up the signal and deliver it to instruments in the cab. The engineer and fireman would hear the warning through headphones or see it as coded indications on a sounder and could act before reaching the hazard. This vision did not require the railroads to abandon their existing telegraph lines. That feature was crucial because companies had already invested heavily in poles, wires, insulators, and offices. Any proposal that called for tearing out those assets and replacing them wholesale would be dismissed immediately. Woods's notes emphasized that his induction circuits could connect directly to current installations using the same batteries and central stations. The new elements lay in the coils near the track and the apparatus under the cars, additions rather than replacements. That modular quality meant that companies might implement the system gradually, beginning with their most dangerous or congested stretches before extending it to quieter lines. He faced a central question that no drawing alone could answer: whether the induced currents in the moving apparatus would be strong and clean enough to be useful over the noise created by the train itself. Locomotives carried their own sources of electrical disturbance in the form of iron masses moving through the Earth's magnetic field, stray currents from lighting systems and arcing at contacts. Wheels on rails generated sparks and electrical noise when they struck small imperfections or when brakes dragged. All of these effects could distort weak-induced signals if the apparatus were not designed carefully. Woods wrote in his notebook about shielding, grounding, and the possibility of using specific signaling frequencies that would be distinguishable from the background. At times, the scale of the challenge tested his resolve. Friends and business associates, even those who respected his ability, asked why he would pursue a scheme that many considered a curiosity rather than a necessity. They pointed out that railroads already maintained telegraph networks, that block systems based on fixed signals were spreading, and that some companies were experimenting with more formalized operating rules to reduce collisions, to them. The idea of wireless communication with moving trains sounded more like an exhibition piece for a fair than a practical tool for everyday operations. Woods answered them with examples drawn from his own experience. He described runs where fog along river bottoms had hidden signals until his locomotive was almost upon them. Times when washouts had been discovered only when the lead truck dropped into a gap, and nights when conflicting orders had left crews uncertain about whether an opposing train had already cleared a single track section. In each scenario, a reliable method of sending a clear warning to a train already in motion, before visual range or ordinary telegraph access, would have given crews more time to react. He did not describe his concept as magic or spectacle, only as an extension of known electrical behavior applied to a known operational problem. In the evenings after these conversations, he returned to his bench and refined his sketches. He specified winding directions for coils, cross-sectional areas for iron cores, and the shapes of frames that would hold the apparatus securely under a car floor. He considered how to package the instrument in the cab so that crews could operate it without distraction from their main duties. If the system required complicated switches or constant adjustment, it would be ignored in emergencies. He wanted the actual user interface to be as simple as possible, perhaps a single key for sending and a single headset or sounder for receiving, with the complexity hidden in the arrangement of coils and circuits beneath the floor and beside the track. By the end of that winter and into the first months of spring, his notebooks contained dozens of pages devoted entirely to induction-based railway communication. Between entries on other projects, such as refinements to electrical brakes and improvements to motor controllers, there ran a clear sequence of thought about what he began to call a multiplex railway telegraph. The word multiplex reflected his intention that the system should handle more than one message or type of signal at the same time without confusion, and his experience with telegraphony convinced him that this was achievable. He did not yet have a full set of hardware built, but the conceptual framework had solidified. In Cincinnati's industrial districts, trains continued to pass with their usual mixture of routine and risk. Crews followed timetables, read orders, and watched signals as they always had, unaware that in a small workshop above the river someone was re-evaluating the relationship between their cabs and the telegraph wires overhead. For them, the idea that messages might someday reach them directly while they rolled between stations would have sounded improbable. For Woods, after reading about Phelps's induction experiments and applying his own experience to the problem, the possibility had shifted from distant speculation to a specific design challenge that he now felt compelled to pursue. The streets of Cincinnati in late 1885 carried a constant rumble from wagons, horse hooves, and the rough grinding of factory machinery. And in that noise, Granville Taylor Woods pushed his railway telegraph from paper and memory into solid iron, wire, and varnished wood. Inside his cluttered workshop, not far from the riverfront smoke and the damp air off the Ohio, the drawings for the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph had moved past sketches and rough schematics. They had become exact plans with dimensions, turn counts for coils, wire gauges, and a clear path from a moving train roof or underframe to the telegraph line that paralleled the track. He had already seen the printed description of Lucius Joshua Phelps' system in Scientific American and had spent long evenings dissecting every phrase, then laying his own ideas over it until he had something broader and more ambitious. His version did more than echo a station signal from a passing car. It treated the train and the line beside the track as parts of a single electrical field, so that dispatchers and train crews could pass messages back and forth while the wheels still turned. Now he needed proof that his diagrams were not just tidy geometry. He needed a working model that could sit on a table, draw current from a real source, and move a telegraph sounder in clear rhythm to the taps of a key. Money sat at the center of the problem. Granville had already learned that patent drawings and court filings swallowed cash faster than any furnace, and the work on his earlier inventions had left little in his pocket. Laboratory power equipment cost more than he could afford. The city's wealthier men could buy their own static machines and large batteries. A black inventor who had to watch every coin could not. So he went searching for current in more unusual places. The Cincinnati Medicated Mud Bath Company occupied a building that smelled of wet earth, heated mineral water, and strong disinfectant. Patients walked in with aching joints, damaged lungs, and chronic skin infections, and attendants lowered them into heavy tubs where warm mud and doctored water covered their bodies. The company kept a large galvanic battery to drive therapeutic currents through bath electrodes, and Granville knew about that battery. He had read about its capacity and had heard rumors of its strength from people who worked nearby. When his own small cells ran flat and he still did not have enough power to test the induction coils of the railway telegraph model, he headed to the Bath Company's office. The officials there might have turned anyone else away. In the 1880s in Cincinnati, respect seldom flowed toward a black man who asked for unusual help. Granville went anyway. He entered in his plain dark suit, carrying a portfolio under his arm lined with careful drawings. The office staff had plenty of familiarity with quack proposals. The era produced endless promises, miracle, tonics, and wild electrical cures. He did not speak in generalities. He unloaded pages that showed coils under a car body, wires running alongside a rail bed, and a complete path for induced current from a moving train to a fixed station key. He explained that he did not want money. He wanted temporary access to their galvanic battery after their patients had gone home for the day. The meeting did not end in a handshake over a new contract or a grand announcement. It ended with permission to use that battery when the baths were closed and when an employee could watch what he did with it. This modest concession held immense value. It meant that a man who could not pay for a laboratory could still conduct laboratory work in the city, late at night, surrounded by mud tubs and tiled walls instead of the polished benches of a university. On those nights, attendants wheeled the heavy battery into a clear corner. Its cells stood in ranks of glass jars filled with liquid that stained the air with acid and metal. Wires ran along the floor to Granville's temporary workbench. He brought his own instruments from his shop, packing them in crates and carrying them across town. The model he assembled there did not imitate a full train. It distilled the core principle of his invention. A long loop of insulated wire stood in for the trackside telegraph line. A separate coil mounted on a movable frame, arranged so that its turns sat close to the line but did not touch it, represented the train apparatus. A telegraph key and sounder completed the setup. When he closed the key on the train side, current flowed through the moving coil, and the battery drove a changing magnetic field into the nearby space. That field did not care that no physical connection joined moving coil and fixed line. It cut across the long loop and induced a current on the trackside side of the apparatus. On the bench, that induced current had to be strong enough to move a relay or sounder armature, not in a vague or hesitant way, but in a firm, readable pattern that another operator could trust while responsible for human lives. The first tests were not smooth. Noise from stray induction and the limitations of the early relay designs made the receiving sounder chatter in a confusing way. He adjusted the number of coil turns, altered the geometry of the movable coil, and experimented with the distance between the two conductors. Every change meant another long walk through the dark city streets to the mud bath building. Another night of running wire across damp floors and another series of taps on the key that had to produce crisp results or be discarded. The bath company staff watched a black inventor hunched over instruments while their own medical employer slept. With each round of adjustments, the received signals sharpened. Granville paid careful attention to how quickly the system responded when he opened and closed the key. Any delay could generate mistakes, especially when a dispatcher tried to juggle multiple conversations on a busy line. He knew how easily human error crept into railroad work. He had seen operators misread a time order and had listened to stories about firemen who thought a mainline section was clear when another train still occupied it. His system had to reduce confusion, not add another source. By the late winter of 1886, the apparatus could send a continuous stream of dots and dashes from the moving coil side to the fixed line side with enough clarity that any trained telegraph operator would recognize words without guessing. That bench test proved that induction alone could carry a message from a conductor's key to the wires that paralleled a railroad. It did not yet prove performance over miles of right-of-way under rain, snow, and mechanical vibration, but it confirmed the principle that the patent office cared about most. The city around him remained indifferent. Cincinnati papers printed longer columns on streetcar franchise disputes, election fights, and society weddings than on the fact that a man in their midst had made a moving train talk to a stationary wire without a direct electrical contact. Black newspapers and Catholic editors paid closer attention. They quoted his patent drawings and described his induction telegraph as a device designed to cut down collisions and save the lives of passengers who boarded trains under the assumption that distance and timing alone kept them safe. Those articles treated him as a serious engineer rather than as a curiosity. The patent process for this new system unfolded in cramped offices in Washington, District of Columbia, and in lawyers' rooms back in Ohio, not in laboratories. Granville had filed patents before, but the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph met a different level of resistance. Lucius Phelps had already secured his own patent on a method for communicating to and from moving vehicles by electricity. American industrial practice treated such overlap as a dispute to be settled by legal procedure rather than by independent recognition for each man. The Patent Office opened a formal interference case to decide whose claims took priority. That interference proceeding, logged under the names of Woods and Phelps, demanded meticulous documentation. Granville had to present letters, witnessed sketches, and detailed descriptions that showed when he had first conceived each part of the system and when he had built critical components. He faced white attorneys who treated his presence as an anomaly. He could not afford to enter the room without a full story etched in dates and technical detail. His attorney, Lucien W. Hosea, pressed him to recall precise sequences, travel dates, and experimental steps. Every inconsistency would give the opposing counsel leverage. He had one advantage that no argument could erase. He had a working model that independent observers had seen, and he had drawn patent office figures that matched that model. He had also developed relay components to amplify the weak induced currents into clear telegraph signals at the receiving end. Those refinements expanded the scope of his system beyond the basic concept of induction between a vehicle and a line. The hearing stretched over months. While the examiners reviewed written submissions, he had to keep earning money. Investors in Cincinnati wanted to hear about revenue, not technical achievements. He continued to design other devices, including improvements to telephone equipment and electric railway control systems, while the fate of the multiplex telegraph wound its way through official channels. The same racial climate that confined black workers to the lowest positions in factories and on railroads also shaped how potential backers regarded him. To many of them, an African-American mechanic could construct a device, but the idea that such a man could lead a complex system of patents and manufacturing plans unsettled their assumptions. Reports made their way back from Washington as examiners weighed the two systems. Patent documents and later published biographies note that the office ultimately decided that Granville's work came first, and that decision gave him recognition as the prior inventor for the induction railway telegraph system. The ruling did not erase Phelps's role in the parallel development of similar ideas, but it placed legal title for the system in Granville's hands. The legal victory carried more than pride. It meant that any American railroad that wanted to use an induction telegraph whose design matched the substantial parts of Granville's scheme would need to deal with his company or those who licensed his patent. During the course of these legal struggles, public mention of his work increased. A black Catholic newspaper in Cincinnati praised him in especially strong language, calling him the greatest inventor of his race and placing his ability on the same level as the most famous white inventors of the period. That coverage was not simply rhetorical celebration. The article identified his induction telegraph as a system that allowed communication to and from moving trains, and it explained in plain language that such communication aimed to reduce accidents and protect property and life. Those columns circulated through black communities that took pride in his achievements, even as the city's leading industrialists remained cautious. Back in Cincinnati, wealthy financiers such as John Gano and Ralph Peters began to see an opportunity in the multiplex telegraph. They were connected to the growing network of electric street railways and cable car systems that were spreading through American cities. A system that could reduce train collisions and improve dispatch control possessed obvious commercial potential. They extended offers to join forces with Granville through new corporate structures bearing his name. In return, they promised to bring capital, factory space, and business acumen that would allow his inventions to move from prototypes and drawings into widespread use. Granville knew what such partnerships could cost him. His earlier experiences with corporations that delayed or withheld wages had left scars as real as the marks that disease had carved on his body years earlier. At the same time, the cost of patent work and legal defense had drained his savings. Without allies who controlled capital, his induction telegraph risked remaining a working model in a mud bath building and a stack of papers in a patent office file instead of a row of instruments along railroads. He chose to proceed, but he did so as a man aware that every contract clause mattered. While lawyers drew up documents, he continued to refine the technical side of the railway telegraph. He explored how to mount the induction coils under cars to protect them from ballast thrown up by wheels. He examined how to insulate the trackside conductor line against weather while keeping it close enough to the moving coil for efficient coupling. He looked for ways to allow two moving trains to communicate with one another through the same system, not just trains to stations. That meant addressing questions of frequency, timing, and the shared use of a single line by multiple users. Demonstrations for potential railroad clients began in controlled settings. Rather than risk early failure on a busy main line, Granville and his associates arranged tests along selected sections of track, where company officials could observe the apparatus without the pressure of a full schedule of trains. In those tests, a car equipped with the induction coil ran along a short stretch while an operator inside sent messages through the key. Station equipment along the line recorded the signals, showing that the receivers could pick up clear messages even as the car moved. Observers saw the sounders click out words in real time that matched the taps they heard from the moving operator's key. Such demonstrations proved that an invisible channel now tied moving trains to the fixed telegraph network. Long wires on the poles lining the right-of-way had already made it possible for dispatchers to talk to each other. With Granville's system, those wires could also listen to the rolling stock that moved between stations. The trains no longer had to remain silent blocks of iron and wood once they left the depot. They could report their position, the state of the track ahead, and the emergencies that arose on board. On November 29, 1887, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 373,915 for Granville Taylor Woods' synchronous multiplex railway telegraph. The document described a method and apparatus that transmitted messages by induction between moving vehicles and stationary lines for the purpose of railway signaling and communication. That patent formalized a reality he had already proven on the benches of the Cincinnati Medicated Mud Bath Company and on test runs over real rails. It acknowledged in the language of legal claims and numbered figures that a black engineer in Ohio had taken the tools of telegraphy and applied them to the moving trains that had once carried him as a fireman and engineer. The patent did not guarantee wealth, and it did not force railroads to purchase his system. Companies decided to invest in safety equipment based on cost, habit, and the competing claims of other inventors. Yet the issuance of that patent placed his name in a registry that industrial leaders watched. It also marked a decisive reply to those who had dismissed wireless train communication as fantasy. In a decade when most people had never touched an electric light switch, the idea that a train could speak through an unseen electrical field between its coil and a line beside the track sounded impossible to many. Granville's working model, legal victory, and official patent reduced that supposed absurdity to a set of carefully drawn diagrams and a device that could be built, installed, and operated by trained men. As the 1880s closed, he stood at a crossroads. He had created and patented a system that addressed a deadly problem on the railroads. He had convinced at least some investors to take notice. He had earned public praise from black newspapers that saw in him proof that a man of African descent could master and extend the newest electrical technologies. At the same time, he had already learned how quickly those with greater access to capital and established corporate power could slow or divert an invention's path. The next years would reveal whether the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph would spread across the continent's tracks, or remain confined to a handful of trials and a place in the history of ideas that arrived ahead of their age, 1887 to 1890. The winter after the patent for the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph was granted, Cincinnati settled into a raw dampness that crept into every unheated room and across every rail yard. Granville T. Wood spent those months moving between his small office on Broadway and the noisy shop floor where his men filed metal, wound coils, and packed wooden crates with delicate instruments that carried his name. Outside, freight trains still ground past the city in long, dark lines, their engines beating against the cold air, their crews as isolated between stations as they had been a decade earlier. The interference fight with Lucius Phelps had ended with that decision in Washington that confirmed Woods as the first to conceive the new induction telegraph system. The legal language on the final papers was dry, but to Woods it meant that the idea he had sketched and refined through years of trial and error now had a clear legal owner. It also meant that the system could be offered to railroads without the threat that some rival would step in later and claim the entire concept. That victory gave weight to every sales letter and every technical circular his company now sent out. By the mid-1880s, Woods and his backers had organized 2 firms in Cincinnati that carried his inventions. The Woods Railway Telegraph Company, created with his brother Lyatas, had been intended to manufacture and sell telephone, telegraph, and signaling equipment. Woods Electric Company, formed with financiers John Gano and Ralph Peters, held and promoted his broader electrical patents. Both firms depended on the same cramped workshop space and the same small staff of machinists and assemblers. The shop smelled of hot varnish, oil, and singed cotton insulation as workers bent over benches fitting brass binding posts, winding insulated copper around iron cores, and testing relays under the eye of foremen who reported directly to Woods. The synchronous multiplex railway telegraph, also known as the induction telegraph, now sat at the center of those operations. In the office, Woods and his technicians refined the transmitter and receiver units so they could stand up to vibration on moving equipment and rough handling by train crews. They adjusted contact springs, strengthened cases, simplified the arrangement of keys and sounders, and prepared clear instructions for railway operators who had never seen anything quite like this system. The central feature remained unchanged, a current sent through a loop along the railway that induced a corresponding current in coils mounted beneath cars or locomotives as they passed overhead. Messages moved as the train moved, without any direct wire connection to the car. On short stretches of track equipped with the new system, the change in railway communication was immediate. Before, a train left a station with written orders and then disappeared into the countryside until it reached the next staff telegraph office. Now, as an equipped train rolled along a line where induction wires paralleled the rails, the operator in the cab could tap out a message at any point and hear the answering click of a sounder connected to the same circuit in a distant depot. Dispatchers in those equipped sections no longer waited for a train to reach a fixed instrument at a station. They could speak with a moving crew, check on its location, change orders, and send warnings while the train stayed in motion. The practical effect on safety in those territories was direct. Contemporary accounts of Woods' system emphasized that it allowed dispatchers to know where each equipped train was along the line and to communicate with crews before a dangerous situation turned into a wreck. In districts that adopted his equipment, the induction telegraph added an extra layer of information on top of the existing block system. A signalman could still rely on his fixed block indicators, but a dispatcher could now also query a moving train and confirm that its crew had seen and acknowledged an order or signal. That combination reduced the chances that a single missed flag, a misread lantern, or a confused timetable entry would end with two trains trying to occupy the same section of track. Beyond those few equipped stretches, however, the national pattern of railway accidents did not change. Newspapers and technical journals still carried regular reports of collisions, derailments, and fires. Writers who covered Woods's work pointed again and again to recent disasters when they described the promise of his invention. One oft-repeated example came from the Pennsylvania Railroad near New Brunswick, New Jersey, where two freight trains had collided on a line that used the ordinary block system. Reports from that wreck described cars reduced to splinters, twisted iron scattered across the right-of-way, 2 lives lost and property damage estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Commentators noted that the block apparatus designed to prevent such collisions had failed, and they used that failure to argue that more reliable electrical safeguards were urgently needed. The men who ran the great trunk lines did not need convincing that accidents were expensive. They understood the cost in damaged equipment, lost cargo, lawsuits, and public anger whenever a story of smashed cars and burned passengers appeared on the front page. Yet they balanced those costs against every dollar spent on new equipment and staff. In that environment, Woods's induction telegraph arrived as both a technical marvel and a financial question. Installing it meant stringing additional conductors along the right-of-way, equipping locomotives and cars with coils and instruments, and training operators to handle moving train traffic as confidently as they handled messages from fixed stations. Managers who had grown used to the existing mix of timetable, train orders, and block signals studied his pamphlets with interest, but also with caution. Inside Woods Electric Company, the difference in outlook between the inventor and his financiers grew sharper through these years. Woods wanted an active electrical engineering firm that designed, built, and installed systems, including his railway telegraph, for paying customers. Gano and Peters looked instead toward a model that held patents and licensed them to larger corporations already connected to railroad purchasing departments. Meetings in the small Cincinnati offices reflected that divide. Woods arrived with drawings of improved coils and signal boxes, along with lists of potential demonstration sites. His partners brought ledgers, letters from patent lawyers, and proposals from established electrical manufacturers who offered to license or acquire his inventions outright. When American Bell Telephone bought his earlier telegraph and telephone combination device, the sale brought in much-needed cash and proved that major companies saw value in his ideas. That transaction also reinforced the pattern his partners favored. A patent could be polished, advertised, and sold, while others took on the risks of manufacturing and installation. For Woods, the sale underscored something different. It showed that once he let go of a patent, control over how the device was built and where it was used passed out of his hands. With the induction telegraph, he hesitated. The system carried his strongest hopes for saving lives on the rails, and he wanted more than a single payment for the rights. During these same years, Thomas Edison and his associates watched developments in induction telegraphy with interest and alarm. Edison himself had earlier worked on systems for railway communication and signaling, and his companies already sold equipment to railroads. When Woods's induction telegraph patents appeared, they overlapped with areas that Edison's organizations wished to claim. Litigation followed. In disputes that ran through the later 1880s, Edison's side challenged Woods's claims before the patent authorities. Each time, the decisions confirmed Woods's priority and upheld his key patents. The outcome made clear that the new system belonged to the Cincinnati inventor, not to the better-known figure from Menlo Park. The legal victory strengthened Woods's reputation but did not end the financial pressure. Lawsuits consumed time and money, and while the cases ran, some companies held back from investing in equipment that might be tied up in court. After losing those contests, Edison's circle shifted tactics. Stories circulated that Edison invited Woods to join his organization in New Jersey, an offer that acknowledged both the value of the induction telegraph and Woods's broader electrical expertise. Woods declined, choosing to continue as an independent inventor and businessman despite the risks. Turning down such an offer meant walking away from the resources of a large laboratory and the protection that association with a famous name might have provided. On the ground, the actual process of introducing Woods's system to working railroaders remained slow. Demonstrations in equipped districts showed that operators could keep up a steady exchange of messages with moving trains. Dispatchers watched needles quiver and sounders clatter as trains reported their progress along the line. Engineers learned that they could receive an urgent stop order without waiting to reach the next station, and that information about obstructions or changed meets could reach them in mid-run. These experiences convinced many of the people who actually moved trains that the induction telegraph added a real margin of safety and flexibility to their work. Resistance often came instead from offices further from the tracks. Senior executives weighed the cost of equipping entire divisions against the prospect of accidents that might or might not occur on their particular lines. Some insisted that existing block systems, if properly maintained and correctly operated, provided adequate protection. Others worried that giving dispatchers continuous access to train crews would disrupt established patterns of authority or encourage too many last-minute changes to operating plans. Behind those technical arguments lay the same social realities Woods faced in every arena: entrenched habits, personal pride among officials who had built careers on older methods, and prejudice against a black inventor who dared to claim an essential role in the future of railway safety. Meanwhile, the daily work inside Woods's shop did not slow. Orders for induction telegraph equipment arrived from railways willing to install the system on limited stretches. The firm built enough instruments to outfit certain lines, but not in the numbers that would have been required to transform the national network. Crates marked for shipment stood stacked against the walls, each holding coils, relays, and instruments wrapped in straw and paper. Young men hauled them out to wagons bound for depots where section crews would mount the coils and run the additional conductors beside existing telegraph lines. As those first installations went into service, the men who used them developed new routines. Train operators on equipped routes took their places in cabs with an extra instrument beside the familiar brake handles and gauges. Dispatchers adjusted to the knowledge that they could verify a train's position by calling it directly, instead of waiting for a station report. Signalmen learned to coordinate fixed signals with reports coming from moving trains, a more complex but more informative pattern of control. In safety letters and technical notes, some railways reported fewer delays and fewer near misses on sections where the induction telegraph operated. Tangible signs that the system was doing the work Woods had promised. For Woods personally, these mixed signs of progress were both gratifying and frustrating. His invention functioned in the field exactly as he had envisioned during long nights of experimentation, and where it was used, crews and dispatchers praised its utility. Yet the number of miles covered by the system remained a small fraction of the total American railway network. Every time a newspaper described another head-on collision or another rear-end crash on an unequipped line, the gap between what his system could do and what railway managers actually chose to adopt stood out even more sharply. By 1890, the strain of holding his Cincinnati enterprises together under these conditions had become severe. Woods Electric Company still followed the cautious licensing-focused strategy preferred by Gano and Peters. The Woods Railway Telegraph Company no longer had the capital to expand installations aggressively on its own. Woods himself juggled design work, patent issues, technical correspondence with railways, and arguments with business partners who did not share his urgency about getting life-saving technology onto the rails. The induction telegraph had carried the first true wireless messages between moving trains and the stations responsible for their safety. Yet the men who invented and refined it now struggled to maintain control of their own creation. That combination of technical success and business frustration set the stage for Woods's next move. The same determination that had kept him at his bench through years of uncertainty now pushed him to leave the arrangements that no longer served his purpose. As the decade closed, he looked beyond Cincinnati toward larger financial markets and a broader electrical industry. The struggle to bring wireless communication to the rails would continue, but from a different city and under new alliances that promised both opportunity and danger. In the first months of 1890, a copy of a New York paper reached Cincinnati that carried a small item about railway communication. The story mentioned improved telegraph systems for trains and, without detail, named Thomas Edison as the man behind the newest advances. The notice was short and casual, tucked beside advertisements for patent medicines and steamship lines, but when Granville Taylor Woods read it in his Broadway office, the wording landed with force. It treated the very idea of electrical safeguards for trains as naturally belonging under Edison's name, with no hint that a different inventor in Ohio already held patents on a working induction telegraph tested on real rails. The misattribution did not surprise him. Edison's reputation had grown into a national symbol. Reporters treated the Menlo Park laboratories as the center of invention, and editors reflexively attached his name to nearly any electrical development, whether or not his companies had touched it. Woods had already spent years watching that pattern spread. Patent bulletins listed his synchronous multiplex railway telegraph in formal type, with his name printed clearly as inventor and Cincinnati as his home. Popular papers, when they mentioned train telegraphy at all, spoke instead of unnamed improvements from leading electrical firms, or folded every new apparatus into the vague category of Edison systems. Inside the Woods Electric Company office, the walls bore framed copies of his patents, including the steam boiler furnace, the telegraphony system, and the induction railway telegraph. On a shelf stood models of his coils and instruments, some recently returned from demonstrations. Yet outside those rooms, arguments about ownership continued in court filings and in the way companies described their equipment in brochures and contracts. Woods had already answered formal challenges to his induction telegraph in the patent system, and official decisions had confirmed his priority. The written rulings did not automatically change how powerful firms spoke about his work in their own advertising. Legal disputes over electrical inventions had become a constant feature of American industry by the late 1880s. Companies with teams of lawyers treated patent interference cases as tools for negotiation and delay. Woods watched that world from its edges. His own fights over induction telegraphy had forced him to learn the rhythm of hearings, affidavits, and technical depositions. He sat in offices with his attorney and sorted through his notes, dated sketches, and letters to reconstruct the exact path from early bench experiments to the finished system. While he continued designing new devices, he understood that one ill-prepared appearance before an examiner could cost him control of work that had taken years to refine. Against that background, the appearance of Edison's name in connection with railway telegraphy represented more than a careless line in a newspaper. Edison's companies had filed their own claims in related fields and now stood across the table from Woods in disputes over who had arrived first at key concepts. The legal arguments took a technical form, comparing claims, dates, and specific circuit arrangements. Underneath those details ran straightforward questions of credit and money. If a court or the patent office had shifted recognition toward Edison's side, Woods's system would have been treated as an imitation instead of as an original design, and every railway that adopted it could have been instructed to deal with others. Woods followed those proceedings closely. Each time a decision reaffirmed his patent, he received news through his attorney rather than through the front pages of national papers. The legal victories protected his right to license the induction telegraph and to build it under his own name. They did not by themselves ensure that railway presidents would line up at his office. The same executives who read about Edison in glowing profiles could still hesitate when faced with the prospect of dealing with an independent black inventor whose company did not carry the weight of an established conglomerate. Within Cincinnati's black community and in the pages of black newspapers around the country, the story looked different. Editors who followed his work drew attention to his wins against more famous rivals and printed detailed descriptions of the induction telegraph. They explained to their readers how his system allowed a train in motion to send and receive messages along existing telegraph lines without direct connection, and they tied that technical fact to the broader reality of railway accidents that continued to kill and injure passengers. In those pages, Woods was not an anonymous mechanic. He was presented as a leading figure in electrical engineering, a man whose work rivaled that of any white inventor in the country. Woods read those articles with a complex mix of pride and unease. The praise recognized his skill, yet the very need for separate coverage underscored how completely much of the white press ignored black achievement. He knew that many railroad officials did not subscribe to black papers. The men who decided what equipment to buy often read trade journals and mainstream dailies that still tended to slot him into a marginal role when they mentioned him at all. Sometimes they described him as a colored electrician from Cincinnati, even when his name appeared on patents that their own companies had requested copies of. The phrase Black Edison began to appear in some commentaries, a label meant as a compliment that also carried its own burden. It suggested that his achievements could be understood only by comparison to a white counterpart, as though his work were a variation on an established model rather than a direct extension of his own experiences in engine cabs, mills, and workshops. Woods recognized the rhetorical value such a title had in reaching audiences who knew Edison's name and grasped what it meant to match his level of output. At the same time, he refused to accept any implication that his induction telegraph or subsequent designs owed their existence to another man's example. The struggle for proper credit did not take place only in courtrooms and editorials. It unfolded in the negotiations that preceded every potential contract. When representatives of rail companies met with Woods or corresponded with his office, they sometimes framed their inquiries in ways that treated his inventions as optional additions to systems they already associated with larger firms. They asked whether his induction telegraph could be adapted to work with equipment from Edison's companies or from other major manufacturers, as though integration into their portfolios mattered more than recognizing the origin of the underlying concept. Woods answered those questions precisely. His correspondence explained that the induction telegraph operated as a distinct system, built to interact with existing telegraph lines but based on his own patented arrangement of coils, circuits, and signaling devices. He pointed out that the patents had survived challenges and that any line using similar induction methods would need to respect his rights. Still, he understood the hesitation behind the inquiries. Railroads feared becoming entangled in legal fights between competing inventors, and they favored solutions backed by companies with large legal departments. A system that carried the name of an independent black inventor appeared to some as a risk rather than as a guarantee. At the same time, he could not ignore the continued stream of accident reports that underlined the need for better communication. Rear-end collisions in fog, head-on crashes on single-track lines, and wrecks caused by washouts or broken rails continued to appear in the news. Investigations often found that trains had left stations under correct orders, only to encounter unexpected conditions that no one had been able to relay in time. Whenever Woods read such accounts, the distance between his working induction telegraph and the policies of companies that declined to adopt it felt measured in shattered cars and burned bodies. He tried different strategies to push his system further into the market. In some proposals, he offered to install the induction telegraph on limited stretches at relatively low initial cost, confident that a successful demonstration would lead to wider orders. In others, he suggested licensing arrangements through larger firms that already supplied equipment to the railroads, hoping that piggybacking on their sales networks would overcome prejudice and caution. Each initiative required careful writing and a willingness to accept that any agreement might shift profits away from him, while still placing his technology on more tracks. The responses varied. A few smaller railroads installed his system on particular divisions, usually stretches known for difficult weather or heavy traffic. Reports from those lines indicated that the induction telegraph functioned as promised, enabling dispatchers to keep closer watch on trains and to issue orders in mid-run. Yet many of the larger railroads, the ones whose adoption would have transformed railway safety on a national scale, replied politely and did nothing. Some officials cited expense. Others claimed that they planned to wait and see how the system performed elsewhere before committing. Behind those formal letters stood a mixture of genuine caution, conservative habit, and the expectation that if the system truly mattered, a major white-controlled firm would soon offer something similar under a more familiar banner. In the midst of these negotiations, inventions in other parts of the electrical field gained attention that overshadowed the induction telegraph. City dwellers watched arc lights and incandescent bulbs transform streets and theaters. Electric streetcars began to replace horse-drawn lines in some towns with their own overhead wires and control systems. Newspapers devoted more space to the spectacle of electrified fairs and to the business battles over urban lighting contracts than to the quiet details of train dispatch procedures. For many readers, electricity became a symbol of entertainment and convenience rather than a tool for preventing specific categories of industrial death. Woods saw that shift clearly, especially as he began to work on electric traction systems himself. Patent lists from the period show a growing portion of his attention devoted to overhead conductors, third rail systems, and control circuits for electric motors. Those fields drew interest from city transit companies and larger manufacturers that saw profit in urban railways. As he moved his work in that direction, he did not forget the induction telegraph, but he accepted that his best chance of maintaining a career as an inventor involved addressing whichever problems the market would pay to solve. The struggle for credit extended into these new areas. When he filed applications for electric railway devices, he entered fields already crowded with patents from inventors such as Charles van de Poel and the engineers employed by major firms. Competitors examined his claims and in some cases initiated new interference proceedings. Woods prepared once again to defend his timelines and his technical originality, knowing that every successful defense preserved not only his rights but also his public status as a credible designer rather than as someone whose ideas were derivative. Even with these pressures, episodes of recognition did break through. Technical societies and journalists who paid close attention to patent bulletins identified him as one of the most prolific black inventors of his era, noting that he had secured dozens of patents in fields that demanded deep familiarity with both mechanical and electrical engineering. Some articles emphasized his self-directed education and his progression from shop apprentice and railroad fireman to recognized engineer. Others highlighted the way his railway telegraphy work anticipated broader developments in wireless communication that would not become widely known until decades later. Yet such recognition did not erase the frustration of seeing his name omitted, minimized, or misused in other contexts. On more than one occasion, a company seeking to market equipment based on ideas close to his own tried to sidestep him by presenting its devices as generic improvements without clear attribution. When he learned of such efforts, he responded through legal channels, sending notices that cited his existing patents and insisting on his rights. In some cases, those interventions led to licensing arrangements or to the quiet withdrawal of offending claims. In others, they resulted only in more delays and expenses as legal correspondence stretched on without conclusion. By 1892, the strain of balancing these battles with his responsibilities in Cincinnati had become untenable. The city had given him his first serious opportunities as an independent engineer. He had built his shop there, secured his early patents, and carried out the experiments that led to the induction telegraph. It had also, in his view, reached the limit of what it could offer. The local capital available through his existing partners came with strings attached that constrained his freedom to steer his inventions and his company according to his own judgment. New York City presented a different prospect. There, major electrical and engineering firms kept headquarters. Patent lawyers who specialized in complex interference cases maintained offices near the centers of trade. Telegraph and telephone companies ran extensive networks across the region. Railway and transit corporations based in the city managed lines that stretched across states. If he wanted to press his claims for credit, to negotiate directly with the largest buyers, and to place himself closer to the heart of the electrical industry, he would have to move east. The decision to leave Cincinnati was not easy. It meant walking away from a workshop he had equipped over the course of a decade and from a community that had celebrated his successes. It also meant stepping into a city where racial prejudice remained entrenched and where competition among inventors was fierce. Yet the accumulation of misattributed credit, cautious responses from distant executives, and the constant need to defend his place in the record pushed him toward that risk. As 1890 moved into the early 1890s, Woods prepared to shift his base of operations. He arranged his affairs in Cincinnati, held conversations with his brother Leates about future collaboration, and gathered the drawings, models, and patent papers that traced his path from furnace improvements and telegraphony to the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph and the new electric railway devices already on his drafting table. The next stage of his life would unfold in New York, where the fight for recognition and adoption would continue under different alliances and in a louder, more crowded setting, but where the stakes, in money and in historical memory, would be even higher. When Granville Taylor Woods stepped off the train in New York City around 1890, the air around the stations carried coal smoke, horse manure, and a dense web of overhead wires that sagged above the streets like a low metal ceiling. Elevated trains rattled by on iron structures, throwing cinders and black dust down on the sidewalks. Beneath them, pushcarts and carriages jammed the avenues, while telegraph and telephone lines hung in tangled clusters from leaning poles. It was into that noise and clutter that Woods brought the patents and drawings he had carried from Cincinnati, including the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph that let moving trains communicate without a direct wire. New York offered something Cincinnati never had. The largest electrical companies kept offices there. Corporate attorneys who specialized in complex patent disputes worked out of buildings within walking distance of the main telegraph exchanges. Rail and transit executives used the city as a base while they shaped lines that reached out across states. Woods knew that if he wanted his inventions to reach beyond a small circle of demonstration lines and limited contracts, he had to stand closer to those decisions. He set up a modest office and workshop, joined once again by his brother Leates, who brought his own inventive skill and willingness to work long hours at the bench. The new shop did not look like the grand laboratories described in popular pieces about Thomas Edison. It was a practical workroom rented in a city where rents climbed quickly, filled with wooden benches, iron vises, and rows of tools arranged by habit rather than by interior designer. Coils of insulated copper wire hung on hooks beside shelves of resistors, relays, and hand-wound transformers. Drawers held patent office copies and contract drafts alongside screwdrivers and calipers. Outside the windows, streetcars clanged over rails and delivery wagons squeezed past each other in tight streets. Inside, Woods and Lyotts tried to turn paper claims into hardware that companies would accept and pay for. By the early 1890s, attention in the electrical field had begun to shift from simple lighting and telegraphy to full electric traction. New York had seen what overhead wires could do to a streetscape. In the great blizzard of 1888, lines had snapped, poles had buckled under ice, and falling wires had electrocuted people in the streets. City officials responded by pressing for wires to be buried or rearranged, and for new systems that would power trains and streetcars more safely. Woods saw that need clearly. His induction telegraph still mattered deeply to him, but the companies holding the largest budgets were now looking for ways to move trains and streetcars by electricity instead of steam. He began filing patents that dealt directly with the problem of feeding power to moving cars without leaving bare live conductors where pedestrians or workers could touch them. Lists of his patents from these years show designs for electric railway supply systems, conduits, overhead conducting systems, and devices to regulate and control the flow of current to motors. Some schemes used insulated bars or rails hidden in protected channels between the running rails. Others used carefully shielded third rails with contact shoes or brushes that could pick up power when needed, then break contact as the car passed so that exposed metal did not remain energized. Railways around the country were wrestling with the same questions, and his drawings dropped directly into that ongoing argument. In February of 1892, one of his most visible New York experiments took shape at Coney Island, out on the Brooklyn shore. There, amid the smells of ocean salt, fried food, and wet wood, an amusement ride known as the Figure-8 roller coaster offered a proving ground for his latest power pickup system. Instead of relying on a continuous overhead cable or a simple gravity drop, the ride used an electrical arrangement that drew current from contact rails concealed in its structure. Woods had adapted a third rail-style device so that the coaster cars could receive power through brushes that pressed against metallic terminal heads only while the car actually passed over them. Once the car moved on, the section behind it de-energized, reducing the chance that a worker or curious rider could touch a live piece of metal. On the day of the test, onlookers watched as the cars crept up the initial incline, powered not by a steam hoist or chain, but by electricity flowing through his apparatus. At the crest, the cars rolled into their plunges and curves, the contact devices making and breaking connection with a rapid series of clacks hidden beneath the roar of wheels and the shouts of passengers. Inspectors measured voltages and currents, checked insulation, and noted that no stray sparks leaped from the protected rails into the open air. The demonstration worked. It showed that his version of a power pickup could deliver controlled current to moving equipment in a way that satisfied both engineers and city officials worried about public safety. That same year, his willingness to confront what he saw as dishonest dealings pushed him into a different kind of public arena. Woods had entered into an arrangement with the American Engineering Company of New York, headed by a man named Albert A. Zerbe. The firm had been involved in marketing and manufacturing electrical apparatus, and Woods believed that its actual performance did not match its promises. In response, he placed advertisements in an engineering trade magazine warning readers not to patronize the company. The language in his warnings was blunt. In a city where reputations could make or break a business, such public criticism guaranteed retaliation. Zerbe answered with a criminal libel charge. The case brought Woods into a New York courtroom facing a white accuser. who expected that the system would take his word more seriously than that of a black inventor who had disrupted business as usual. The facts of the complaint revolved around printed words and their effect on trade, but behind those details lay a straightforward question about whose voice counted. Witnesses described dealings with the American Engineering Company in the context of Woods's warnings. The jury did not take long to decide. After a short deliberation, they returned a verdict that cleared Woods of the criminal libel charge. A related civil suit lingered for several years before it too was dismissed. For once, the legal outcome matched the reality he had tried to expose. During these New York years, his output as an inventor reached a sustained pace that few could match. Patent summaries and historical studies count more than 50 patents over his lifetime, with around 15 directly tied to electric railway appliances. Many of those later patents covered motor controllers, automatic circuit breakers, safety cutouts, and braking systems for electric cars. General Electric purchased several of his electric railway patents. Westinghouse acquired patents for electric brake controllers. Harry Ward Leonard, a prominent engineer who had worked with Edison before launching his own ventures, bought multiple patents covering motor control. Each sale put much-needed money into Woods's hands and linked his ideas to the hardware that moved passengers in real cities. Despite these sales, he did not become a rich man. Companies often paid sums that kept him afloat but did not match the long-term value of the devices they absorbed into their product lines. Once a patent changed hands, the original inventor's name often vanished from catalogs and manuals. A car builder might install an electric brake controller based on his design without any crew member ever hearing the name. Woods. A substation might contain regulators shaped by his circuit logic, while operating staff knew only the brand of the company that bought the patent. He had left the anonymity of shop floors years earlier, only to encounter a new form of partial invisibility inside corporate structures that separated invention from branding. While he worked on power distribution and motor control, the world around the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph shifted. Railroads continued to extend their lines, and collisions caused by human error did not stop. In 1893, near Roby, Indiana, during the Chicago World's Fair, a head-on collision between two trains killed 13 people and injured many more. Reports described splintered coaches, broken iron, and bodies laid out beside the tracks in rows. Investigators concluded that mismanagement of train movements and failure to protect sections of track properly had turned routine operations into a disaster. In October 1901 in North Carolina, a freight engineer misread a telegraph message about the sections of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show train. After the first section passed, he returned his freight train to the line, unaware that a second section followed. The collision smashed wooden cars and injured performers and crew. In July 1900, near Rockfish, Virginia, a misread train order led to a collision between a passenger train and a freight on the Southern Railway, killing passengers and crew. Each of these wrecks and others like them highlighted the same weakness. The safety of trains still depended on written orders, station-to-station telegraph messages, and signals that a crew could see only when close to them. When those orders were miscopied, misunderstood, or not delivered in time, steel and wood met at full speed. Technical journals and government inquiries held debates about automatic block signals, interlockings, and more rigorous rules for telegraph operators. Engineers wrote that better electrical safeguards were essential, and that devices which carried more complete information to crews while they were in motion could reduce accidents. The basic need that had driven Woods to develop an induction telegraph system in the previous decade remained painfully clear. Yet widespread adoption of his wireless train telegraph did not follow. Automatic block signaling based on track circuits, mechanical and later electric semaphores, and disc signals spread across thousands of miles of track. Those systems required capital and maintenance, but they fit more comfortably into the existing habits of railway officials. They did not ask companies to install additional conductors for induction along lines already filled with wires. They aimed to make sections of track self-reporting rather than equipping every train with an extra instrument for direct communication. In parallel, new forms of wireless telegraphy that used radio waves instead of induction began to appear, capturing the imagination of investors and the public. Against that backdrop, Woods's system looked to many managers like one more expensive layer in a field already crowded with competing claims. From his perspective in New York, the situation looked less abstract. He knew exactly how it felt to sit in a locomotive cab with only a folded timetable, a handful of train orders, and the blowing of the whistle to stand between order and disaster. The induction telegraph had been his answer to that memory. He watched as other technologies rushed into the gap he had identified. Automatic block systems reduced some forms of collision. Radio promised long-range signaling at sea and later on land. Telephones crept into dispatch offices. In this changing environment, his patented method for using the static field of telegraph lines as a medium for direct train communication remained a proven but underused option rather than a standard. Day to day, however, he could not afford to dwell only on what railroads ignored. Work in his New York shop continued up to the end of his life. He refined brake apparatus so that electric trains could stop more smoothly and safely. He adjusted regulators designed to keep motor speeds within safe limits on grades. He worked on vehicle control systems that allowed operators to manage cars more precisely in crowded urban streets. Accounts from the period note that between his arrival in New York and his death in 1910, he sold more than 20 patents in emerging technologies, including multiple electric railway and control patents to major firms. Life outside the workshop never became easy. Racial barriers did not vanish simply because corporations wanted his patents. Landlords still charged what the market would bear for cramped rooms. Restaurants and clubs kept color lines that limited where he could relax or meet clients. He lived in a city that advertised itself as modern while maintaining old prejudices on every corner. The strain of constant work, legal battles, and negotiations wore on his health. Years of exposure to smoke in engine cabs and to chemicals in workshops had already taken a toll on his lungs and immune system. He had survived smallpox earlier in life. Now in his 50s, he carried the accumulated damage of decades in harsh industrial environments. On winter nights, the elevated trains clattered past the blocks where he rented rooms, their interiors glowing through dirty windows as they carried workers and families home. Underground, the first elements of what would become the New York City subway system took shape, using third rail and power distribution concepts that overlapped with ideas in his patents. Passengers who rode those early electric trains rarely knew that a black inventor who lived within a few miles had contributed directly to the technologies that moved them. In black newspapers and community gatherings, he remained a point of pride, often described as the greatest inventor of his race. In wider public discourse, he became a name used occasionally in lists of curious facts, or as a foil in stories about Edison, rather than as a central figure in his own right. On January 30th, 1910, in Harlem Hospital, Granville Taylor Woods died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 53 years old. By that date, he had secured dozens of patents, including about 15 appliances for electric railways. He had sold patents to companies such as Westinghouse, General Electric, and other major manufacturers. His devices helped move and control electric trains and streetcars in cities that were still expanding their systems. His railway telegraph had already been absorbed into the background of signaling history, recognized by specialists but rarely mentioned in the same breath as the more publicized achievements of white contemporaries. His burial took place at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, in a grave that remained unmarked for decades. The man who had worked to prevent trains from crashing in the dark and who had devised ways to send power safely through rails and conduits was laid into the ground without a stone to carry his name. Years later, a historian traced his resting place and persuaded corporations that had benefited from his inventions to contribute funds for a proper headstone. Only then did a marker rise above the soil, listing the dates of his life and acknowledging him as an inventor. From a modern point of view, the contrast stands out sharply. In the 1880s, Granville Woods showed that wireless communication with moving trains was possible using the infrastructure already in place. He built and patented equipment that allowed dispatchers to talk to trains while they rolled between stations, and that gave crews a way to report dangers ahead. Railroads tested the system and saw it work, yet most companies chose not to adopt it widely, even as misread orders, delayed warnings, and missed signals continued to kill passengers and crews. During the same period, some of those same companies purchased his patents for electric brakes, power pickup devices, and control circuits, then folded that technology into systems that millions of people still ride today. By the time the 20th century matured, new wireless methods and more advanced signaling practices had altered the landscape of railway safety. The induction-based multiplex railway telegraph that Woods once demonstrated as a direct answer to collisions had become a largely forgotten bridge between the age of wires and the age of radio. The fact that trains today can communicate continuously with dispatchers and that electric rails move cars through tunnels without exposing live metal to crowds reflects the future he worked toward, even when his own name dropped out of daily conversation. In the years between his move to New York and his death in Harlem, he lived with the knowledge that he had proved something the world considered absurd, and with the reality that industry had never fully embraced that proof in time to save all the lives it could have saved. April 24, 1975, an uneven line of cars rolled past St. Michael's Cemetery on Astoria Boulevard, while a small group walked toward a grave that had never carried a name. The cemetery lay under the flight path of LaGuardia Airport, so the voices of the people crossing the grass rose between the sound of traffic and the thunder of jets lifting off over Queens. Near a modest plot not far from Scott Joplin's resting place, workers had set a new bronze marker on a stone base. Until that morning, the man beneath that soil had no monument. Now, representatives from Western Electric cemetery staff and a few historians stood in front of the stone and listened as a speaker described a life that had once revolved around hard coal smoke, iron rails, and crude telegraph keys. The new headstone bore a simple inscription with dates that stretched from 1856 to 1910, and a single word that had never appeared on any stone above him before: Inventor. The person who had pushed for this ceremony, historian M.A. Harris, watched as the covering cloth came away and the metal caught weak spring light. Harris had spent years tracking down the grave of Granville Taylor Woods, reading old records that listed his burial at St. Michael's but gave no plot number. Then walking the grounds until a worker pointed out an unmarked section in an old row. Once the spot had been identified, Harris wrote letters and made calls to companies that had long since absorbed Wood's patents into their own equipment. Western Electric agreed to pay for a marker. The result was this small, late correction to 6.5 decades of silence. The people gathered there heard more than a list of patents. Harris and other speakers described a career that had moved from machine shops and locomotive cabs to experiments in Cincinnati and New York. They spoke of an induction railway telegraph that allowed moving trains to communicate with fixed lines without a wire running directly to the car. For more than one person standing in the damp grass, that detail was the first time they had heard, in plain terms, that full wireless communication with trains had been put into service before voice radio, before commercial broadcasting, and before the general public had any idea what a wireless set looked like. Outside the cemetery fence, New York City transit trains passed along electrified rails using third rail and power feed designs that bore the imprint of Woods's later patents. Their operators monitored signals governed by automatic control systems shaped by ideas that came out of the same workshops where his induction telegraph had been born. None of those crews heard anything about the ceremony that day. Their training manuals named corporate suppliers and trade names, not the individual who had sold power pickup and control patents to General Electric and Westinghouse. The disconnect highlighted the pattern that scholars would later describe in detail, a life in which central ideas moved into standard practice while the person who first staked them out vanished from public memory. In the years that followed, the headstone at St. Michael's became a reference point whenever someone in New York wanted to speak about Black contributions to engineering, or about neglected figures in the city's industrial past. Visitors from schools and community groups walked past the rows of graves until they reached the bronze plate that finally confirmed that Granville T. Woods lay there. Guides told them how his railway telegraph had tied moving trains to existing telegraph lines and how, without that system, crews in his era had worked in isolation between stations. For students raised in a world of constant wireless signals, the idea that 19th century trains had once carried their own form of wireless communication, then lost it, made an impression that dry patent dates never could. At the same time, historians outside New York began to reconstruct his story in more systematic form. Early in the 20th century, patent examiner Henry E. Baker had compiled lists of patents granted to Black inventors, and Woods's name appeared on those lists with repeated entries. That work, however, had remained largely inside government files and specialized journals. In the later 1970s and 1980s, scholars such as Michael Christopher and others in Black Studies programs started to examine those patent records alongside newspaper archives, corporate files, and court documents. They found detailed accounts of the interference proceedings, the nights in borrowed laboratories, the contracts with capital backers, and the forgotten lines of equipment orders that traced the real reach of his railway telegraph. Those studies corrected myths that had grown up around him while still emphasizing the radical nature of his communication work. Popular accounts sometimes claimed that he had invented third-rail electrification outright, or that he had single-handedly created the entire concept of modern rapid transit. Close examination showed that his third-rail work built on an existing field and that his contributions lay in specific safety improvements and power control schemes. At the same time, the same researchers confirmed with patent copies and technical descriptions that his synchronous multiplex railway telegraph had extended existing telegraph infrastructure into a true wireless system for trains decades before radio took over that function. They showed, by tracing the actual contents of the claims, that the apparatus depended on induction between a telegraph line and coils on a moving train, not on electromagnetic waves traveling through open space, but that it still delivered full two-way signaling between a vehicle and the ground without a physical wire connection. In some modern writing, careless wording has pushed him into titles he never claimed. A few pieces refer to him as a father of radio or imply that his induction telegraph stands in a direct line with later vacuum tube transmitters. Technical histories correct that exaggeration. They point out that his system used the near field of telegraph lines and required specific hardware mounted along the right-of-way. Yet those same histories accept that his apparatus tested on actual trains and granted a United States patent in 1887 met the basic requirement that defines wireless train communication in practical terms. A crew on a moving train could send and receive messages from a dispatcher without plugging into a fixed terminal. That fact, stripped of slogans, is what made the technology so far ahead of its time, and what made its limited adoption such a striking loss. As scholars dug into accident reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, They found repeated examples of wrecks that unfolded along patterns Woods had identified in his own notes. Train orders miscopied at a station. A dispatch message delivered too late because the train had already left the telegraph office. A washout or rock slide discovered by track walkers that could not be telegraphed quickly enough to reach an approaching crew. In the years when his railway telegraph was ready to be installed, most lines still relied on those brittle chains of communication. Only a handful of divisions adopted his system or similar induction equipment. Historians looking back linked that hesitation to investment priorities, to corporate distrust of outside patentees, and to a pattern in which devices that protected freight and equipment often lagged behind devices that increased raw speed or freight capacity. The question that interests modern engineers is not whether his system would have prevented every wreck. No system, even the fully computerized positive train control used today, can erase every risk linked to mechanical failure, human fatigue, or extreme weather. The question is how many of the collisions that hinged on pure communication breakdown could have been softened or avoided if moving trains had carried a reliable link to dispatch in the years before radio. When that question is applied directly to the period from 1887 to the first decades of the 20th century, the answer is not neat, but patterns do emerge. Wherever dispatchers needed to change orders on short notice, and wherever trains moved through long stretches without staffed stations, an induction telegraph could have delivered extra minutes of warning that make the difference between a controlled stop and a pile of crushed cars. Despite that logic, railway managers of his era made choices that sidelined the system. The large trunk roads invested heavily in track circuit-based automatic block systems. Those installations gave signalmen track occupancy information without having to reach individual crews, and they fit cleanly into the existing hierarchy of control. When radio arrived later, it came packaged by major firms with strong federal backing for marine and military use, then expanded onto land. Induction train telegraphs, including Woods's system and its variants, ended up in trade catalogs and experimental sections of technical journals rather than on every locomotive roster. In that context, his biggest advance in communication became a specialized tool deployed in limited territories instead of a universal fixture of rail operations. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a different set of institutions began to claim him. Baltimore City Community College created a scholarship program that bears his name, aimed at students pursuing technical fields. In 2004, the New York City Transit Authority produced an exhibition about his life and work, placing displays in bus and rail depots and printing millions of Metro cards that carried his name and a brief description of his third rail contributions. In 2006, the National Inventors Hall of Fame added him to its roster, acknowledging the technical weight of his patents. 2 years later, the corner of Stillwell Avenue and Mermaid Avenue in Brooklyn received a new street sign. Granville T. Woods Way, installed within sight of the Coney Island terminus where trains still draw power through systems he helped shape. At St. Michael's Cemetery, tributes continued. Annual events organized by cemetery staff and community advocates combined concerts honoring Scott Joplin with talks about Woods's inventions. Speakers described how New York's early subway and elevated lines had relied on third rail and conduit approaches that intersected with his patent work, and how those same lines could have benefited from his induction telegraph if it had been applied fully to the dispatch problem. Children from nearby neighborhoods followed programs that led them from the bronze headstone to modern images of subways and control centers, asking why a man whose ideas had entered so many parts of the system had remained without a grave marker. For 65 years, in academic circles, his case became a central example in discussions about race and technology. Authors such as Rayvon Fouché examined his career to show how black inventors navigated a patent system in an industrial economy structured by segregation. They documented how companies delayed payments, fought over credit, and used legal tactics to pressure independent inventors into selling rights on terms that favored corporate shareholders. In those studies, the induction railway telegraph appears as a focal point because it crossed so many boundaries at once. It joined telegraphy, railway signaling, and early forms of wireless communication. It demanded cooperation from conservative managers, cooperation that he had trouble securing in a culture that doubted a black engineer's expertise even after patent examiners had accepted it. Modern railway safety efforts using digital radio and satellite-based tracking have rediscovered some of the same principles that lay at the heart of his system. Centralized traffic control centers now maintain continuous contact with trains. Crews receive warnings through screens and radios as they move, not only at stations. Data about positions and speeds flows constantly back to dispatch. The physical means are different, and the underlying physics relies on radio waves rather than induction through telegraph lines. But the operational logic is similar. Information must reach a moving train quickly and unambiguously if it is going to prevent disaster. When contemporary engineers teach that principle, most do so without any mention of the man in Cincinnati who built a working version of that continuous communication channel in the 1880s. For people who stand at his headstone now, or who ride trains over third rails that owe something to his work, the timeline forms a simple sequence. First came a black machinist and fireman who studied telecommunications until he found a way to speak to trains through fields around existing wires. Then came a half-century in which his method remained rare while railroads adopted other systems and endured wrecks that better communication might have softened. Finally came a period of wider recognition in which his name entered scholarship funds, and street signs, even as modern systems solved the problem he had identified with different tools. Through that sequence, one fact does not change. In the 1880s, when the idea of wireless communication at all sounded strange to most people, Granville Taylor Woods designed, built, and tested a wireless link to moving trains that worked, and the world around him did not adjust its habits fast enough to fully utilize it.